Pucked around and found out. A hockey rom-com featuring hidden identities, rival energy, and one ill-advised media campaign. Hearts on Ice, Book 2. Win Valentine. Copyright 2025 by Win Valentine.
All rights reserved.
No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities, is entirely coincidental. Win Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Chapter 1. Bin Zone. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet, which should have been Vanessa's first warning that this wasn't going to be a normal Tuesday morning. She pushed through the door, balancing her tablet and an oversized mug, expecting the usual dry rundown of social media metrics and sponsor obligations. Instead, she found Grace Whitby, practically vibrating in her chair, clutching a presentation folder thick enough to double as a weapon. Grace had joined the media team 3 months ago as the new assistant coordinator, technically reporting to Vanessa, but given unusual creative freedom due to her digital marketing background. What she lacked in experience, she made up for in enthusiasm and an uncanny understanding of social media algorithms. Operation Crush Control was written across the front in Grace's careful block lettering, decorated with tiny hearts that somehow made the whole thing more ominous. Perfect timing! Grace bounced up from her seat, glasses sliding down her nose. I've been waiting to share this with the team. This is going to revolutionize our Q4 engagement metrics. Vanessa slid into her usual spot near the back corner, where she could see both the screen and the door. Morning, Grace. What exactly are we crushing today? Not crushing. Reconnecting. Grace flipped open the folder with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling the crown jewels. I've been analyzing our audience demographics, and there's this massive untapped market of nostalgia-driven content. People love throwback moments, first-time stories, that whole remember when energy. Coach Danvers walked in looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, including the dentist. He dropped into a chair and immediately started checking his phone. Please tell me this doesn't involve the guys wearing throwback jerseys again. Monroe nearly started a riot over the fabric. Even better. Grace connected her laptop to the projector with the precision of someone who'd practiced this moment. I'm calling it the First Crush Throwback campaign. We're going to feature current team members talking about their first crushes, first dates, first times falling for someone. Vanessa's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. First times? Not those first times, Grace clarified, completely missing the way Vanessa had gone rigid. First romantic moments, the innocent stuff that makes people feel all warm and connected. Studies show that nostalgia-based content generates 43% more engagement than standard promotional material. The projector hummed to life, and Grace's mood board filled the screen. Pink and red graphics swirled around stock photos of couples holding hands and sharing milkshakes, bordered by what looked suspiciously like clip art hearts. It was aggressively wholesome in a way that made Vanessa's teeth ache. I've been gathering archival material from team events over the past few years, Grace continued, clicking to the next slide. Look at all this authentic content we've been sitting on! Exclamation. Photos cascaded across the screen. Players at charity events, team building exercises, holiday parties. Vanessa recognized most of them, having shot or organized half these events herself. Grace had arranged them in a collage that emphasized candid moments and genuine smiles. Then Vanessa saw it. Tucked in the bottom corner of the slide, barely larger than a thumbnail, was a photo she hadn't seen in years. A girl in silver figure skates, dark hair pulled back in a competition-perfect bun, mid-spin with her arms extended. The image was grainy and obviously cropped from a larger shot, Vanessa's stomach dropped to somewhere around her ankles.
That was her. From the regional championships, 8 years ago, before everything fell apart. Before Nessa Kim disappeared and Vanessa Quinn took her place, complete with a legal name change that had felt like the first real choice she'd made for herself in years. Natural chemistry that our audience is already responding to, Grace was saying, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. I mean, look at the comment threads from last week's practice footage. People are shipping them without any prompting from us.
Vanessa forced herself to focus, gripping her coffee cup like a lifeline. Sorry, shipping who?
You and Tyler Monroe, obviously. Grace's smile was blindingly bright. The mysterious tension, the way you two bounce off each other during interviews, it's like totally authentic but also completely professional. Our analytics show that any content featuring both of you gets 20% higher engagement.
That's... Vanessa cleared her throat, trying to sound casual instead of panicked. That's interesting. But before we get into casting decisions, shouldn't we talk budget allocation? I mean, what's our spend ceiling on archival licensing? She stood up as casually as possible, angling herself so that her body blocked the other attendees' view of the screen. And production costs for this kind of content can escalate quickly if we're not careful about scope. Grace blinked, clearly not expecting to dive into budget details during her creative pitch. Oh, well, I haven't run the numbers yet, but because quality archival content isn't cheap, Vanessa continued, her heart hammering against her ribs. We need to make sure we're being strategic about which materials we actually purchase licensing for.
Coach Danvers looked up from his phone long enough to grunt. She's right. Last thing we need is accountant breathing down our necks because someone got excited about old footage.
Of course, Grace said, clicking to the next slide. I totally understand the importance of fiscal responsibility, but the potential ROI on this campaign is significant, Vanessa cut in smoothly, which is why we should be extra careful about execution. She moved slightly, making sure the screen stayed blocked. What's your timeline looking like?
I was thinking we could launch next week, Grace said, practically bouncing. Strike while the engagement is hot, you know? And I already have the perfect pairing in mind.
Here it comes, Vanessa thought.
You and Tyler Monroe,
Grace announced, like she was revealing the winner of a major award.
The mysterious tension between you two is absolutely electric. Like, our followers are already creating fan theories about your relationship status.
Vanessa's forced smile felt like it might crack her face in half. Fan theories?
They think you're secretly dating, but trying to keep it professional, Grace continued, oblivious to the way Vanessa had gone pale. Which is perfect for the campaign. We can play into that energy without confirming or denying anything. It's like the ultimate will they, won't they content. This was the exact opposite of staying under the radar. This was like strapping herself to a spotlight and hoping no one noticed.
That's an interesting concept, Vanessa managed. But don't you think...
Enough. Coach Danvers' voice cut through the room like a whistle blast. I don't care about fan theories or engagement metrics or whatever the hell else you kids are obsessing about. I care about wins, and I care about keeping my players focused. This whole thing sounds like a distraction.
Grace's face fell.
But coach...
But nothing. You want to make feel-good content? Fine. Quinn, you're running point on this circus. He stood up, already reaching for the door. You're the media coordinator, so coordinate. You and your assistant here can make the content, but you keep Monroe out of trouble. That kid's one bad headline away from a suspension, and I won't have some social media campaign pushing him over the edge.
Vanessa felt the walls closing in. Refusing the assignment would raise questions about why she didn't want to work with Tyler. Accepting it meant spending extensive time with the one person who might eventually remember a girl in silver skates from his past.
Of course, she heard herself say. I'd be happy to take point.
Perfect. Grace clapped her hands together. I'll send you all my research files and the mood boards. Oh, and I have tons more archival footage we can use. I've been collecting material from everywhere. Team events, community outreach, even some older competition footage I found in the league database. Vanessa's blood turned to ice water. Competition footage? ? Just background stuff mostly. But it's great for establishing atmosphere and showing the broader skating community. Grace started gathering her materials. I'll pull everything together and we can review it tomorrow morning. Actually, Vanessa said carefully, why don't I take a look at all the archival material tonight? For quality control. Make sure everything fits our brand standards before we commit to any specific direction.
That would be amazing, Grace said, relief evident in her voice. I'll upload everything to the shared drive. There's probably 6 hours of footage, but most of it is really good quality.
6 hours of footage that might contain more evidence of her former life. Vanessa nodded, her mind already racing through damage control strategies. Perfect. I'll review everything and we can discuss next steps tomorrow. Coach Danvers had already left and the other attendees were packing up their things. Grace was still talking about engagement strategies and authentic moments, but Vanessa was only half listening. She needed to get to that shared drive before anyone else had a chance to dig through the archives.
I'm just going to grab some more coffee, she told Grace, gesturing toward the door. This is going to be a long night of prep work. Grace nodded enthusiastically and hurried out, probably to update her 17 different spreadsheets with the meeting results. Vanessa waited until the hallway sounds faded, then slipped back into the conference room. Grace's laptop was still connected to the projector, the presentation frozen on a slide full of potential interview questions. Vanessa's hands shook slightly as she navigated back to the archival footage slide, the one with her photo tucked in the corner. There it was again. That girl in silver skates, frozen mid-spin in a moment that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Vanessa stared at the image for a long moment, remembering the weight of competition nerves and the sound of blades carving ice, before everything went wrong. Before she learned that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She found the source file and deleted the image, then cleared it from the recycling folder for good measure. Her movements were methodical, efficient, the same way she'd learned to edit herself out of other people's stories. One photo down. Potentially dozens more to go. When Grace returned 5 minutes later, with a stack of promotional flyers, she found Vanessa standing by the window, tablet in hand, looking like she was deep in strategic planning. I've been thinking about your timeline, Vanessa said without turning around. Next week might be ambitious, but if we're strategic about content creation, we could probably pull together something really compelling. Really? Grace's whole face lit up. Because I have so many ideas about authentic moments we could capture. Like, what if we filmed you and Tyler talking about first crushes in different locations around the arena? The team kitchen, the equipment room, maybe even on the ice after practice. Vanessa finally turned from the window, her professional smile firmly back in place. Those are interesting concepts. Let's see what the archival review turns up first. But inside, her mind was spinning through worst-case scenarios. Being on camera with Tyler was dangerous enough when they were discussing game strategy or upcoming events. Having conversations about first crushes and romantic history while cameras rolled felt like volunteering for emotional Russian roulette. This is going to be such great content, Grace continued, practically glowing with excitement. The fans are going to absolutely lose their minds when they see you two together in a more personal setting. Vanessa nodded and made appropriate sounds of agreement, but she was already calculating exit strategies and damage control plans. She'd built her entire second career around controlling narratives and staying safely behind the camera. Now she was committed to stepping directly into the spotlight with the one person who might recognize her for who she used to be. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to protect her secret, she'd just agreed to the exact kind of exposure that could destroy everything she'd carefully constructed. But walking away now would raise even more questions, and Grace's enthusiasm was already spreading through the room like a particularly persistent virus. Vanessa was trapped, and they both knew it. I should get started on that archival review, she said, gathering her things. Long night ahead. I'll send you everything as soon as I get back to my desk, Grace promised. This is going to be incredible, Vanessa. I can feel it. Vanessa walked out of the conference room with a smile that felt like armor, her mind already racing through the dozens of ways this could all fall apart. She had maybe 12 hours to scrub years of archival footage before Grace expected a progress report. And somewhere in the building, Tyler Monroe was probably finishing up practice completely unaware that he was about to become her co-star in the most dangerous performance of her life. Chapter 2. Punchlines and penalties. The ice felt good under his skates, better than the weight of another reporter's judgment or the sting of yesterday's headlines. Tyler pushed harder into his final sprint drill, letting the burn in his legs drown out everything else. Practice was supposed to be sanctuary,
the one place where his reputation couldn't follow him around like a particularly persistent shadow. He should have known. It wouldn't last.
Monroe!
Coach Danvers' voice cut across the rink with the subtlety of a freight train. Get your ass over here! Tyler coasted to a stop near the bench, steam rising from his shoulders. The rest of the team was already filing toward the tunnel, and he'd been so close to escaping unnoticed. What's up, Coach? Your little chat with that reporter yesterday? Danvers crossed his arms, and Tyler knew immediately this wasn't going to be a congratulatory conversation about his defensive play. Care to explain why I'm getting calls about your colorful commentary on media relations? Tyler pulled off his helmet and ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. Guy was asking invasive questions about my personal life. I told him exactly where he could put his microphone. In slightly more creative terms than that, according to my understanding. Maybe? Tyler wasn't about to apologize for defending his privacy. The reporter had been fishing for dirt about his family, and Tyler drew hard lines around subjects that weren't up for public consumption. Danvers studied him with the expression of a man who'd been dealing with difficult players longer than Tyler had been alive. Well, congratulations. Your mouth just earned you a starring role in Grace's new promotional campaign. Well, what promotional campaign?
The one where you get to smile pretty for the cameras and pretend you have social skills.
Danvers' grin was absolutely predatory.
Starts today, Studio B. Don't make me drag you there.
Tyler opened his mouth to argue, but Theo's voice interrupted from the tunnel entrance.
Ooh, did someone say promotional campaign? Theo skated over with the kind of enthusiasm that usually preceded Tyler's headaches. Are we talking about the romance one? The one where you get to play pretend boyfriend with the scary media lady?
How do you know about... Tyler started. Grace has been texting the group chat all morning. Theo produced his phone and started scrolling through what appeared to be dozens of messages. She used the words authentic chemistry 17 times. Also, she listed you as her dream casting choice, which feels both flattering and mildly disturbing. Coach Danvers was already walking away, apparently satisfied that Tyler's fate was sealed. 1 hour. Studio B. Try not to traumatize our media coordinator. Tyler watched him disappear into the tunnel, then turned to find Theo practically vibrating with excitement. This is incredible, Theo said, falling into step beside Tyler as they headed toward the locker room. Do you know how long it's been since we had decent teen drama? Bodie's all domesticated now, and the rest of these guys are boring as hell. It's not drama, it's punishment. Potato. Theo waved dismissively. The point is, you're about to get up close and personal with Vanessa Quinn, who is simultaneously terrifying and the most professional person in this entire building. This is better than cable. Tyler stopped walking. Wait, Quinn? The sideline reporter? That's the one. Dark hair, sharp suits, has never smiled during a team meeting as far as anyone can remember. Theo grinned wickedly. Should be fun watching you try to charm your way past that particular defense system. They continued toward the locker room, but Tyler found his mind drifting to the few interactions he'd had with the team's media coordinator. Brief, professional exchanges during interviews or team announcements. She'd always been competent, efficient, and completely unreadable. The kind of person who treated every conversation like a carefully orchestrated business transaction, which, he supposed, was exactly what this promotional campaign would be. I'm telling you, this has potential, Theo continued, apparently unaware of Tyler's growing dread. You're all broody and mysterious. She's all controlled and untouchable. It's like watching an immovable object about to meet an unstoppable force. That usually ends in explosions. Exactly! Theo clapped him on the shoulder. Entertainment value through the roof. Tyler showered quickly and changed into clean clothes, trying not to think about the fact that he was about to spend however long pretending to have chemistry with someone he'd barely spoken to. The whole concept felt artificial and staged, exactly the kind of media manipulation he'd learned to distrust. But arguing with Coach Danvers was pointless, and Tyler had already used up his quota of controversial statements for the week. Better to get this over with and hope Grace's attention span moved on to someone else's love life. Theo insisted on accompanying him to Studio B, providing a running commentary that Tyler mostly ignored. I wonder if they'll make you do those cheesy posed photos, Theo mused as they walked through the arena corridors. You know, like looking deeply into each other's eyes while standing inappropriately close. Or maybe they'll go for the candid conversation angle where you're both laughing at something off camera. I'm not laughing at anything. See, that's your problem right there. No sense of theatrical drama. Theo gestured expansively. This could be your chance to show a softer side.
Maybe attract some of those fans who think you're too intimidating. I don't want to attract fans who need me to be softer. They reached Studio B, and Tyler paused outside the door. He could hear movement inside, the sound of equipment being adjusted, and Grace's voice providing what sounded like detailed instructions about lighting angles.
"Ready for your close-up?" Theo asked, clearly enjoying this way too much. Tyler pushed open the door without answering, stepping into the controlled chaos of a professional media setup. Ring lights blazed from multiple angles, casting everything in stark, artificial brightness. A camera stood ready on a tripod, and a backdrop displayed the Vipers logo with military precision. And there, adjusting one of the lights with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb, was Vanessa Quinn. Tyler had seen her around the team facilities plenty of times, but never in her natural habitat like this. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail that somehow looked both professional and effortless. She wore a navy blazer over dark jeans, and every movement was economical, purposeful. No wasted motion, no unnecessary flourishes. Something about watching her work made him pause in the doorway longer than necessary. There was a confidence in the way she handled the equipment. Like she'd done this exact routine hundreds of times but still demanded perfection from every detail. She looked up when the door closed, and Tyler caught a glimpse of dark eyes that seemed to catalog information faster than most people could process it. "Mr. Monroe?" She approached with her hand extended, her smile polite and utterly professional. "I'm Vanessa Quinn, media coordinator. Thank you for participating in today's promotional content." Tyler shook her hand, noting that her grip was firm and brief, no lingering, no unnecessary contact. "Just Tyler is fine." "Tyler, then." She gestured toward the setup behind her. "We'll be filming a series of conversational segments about team dynamics and personal growth. Grace has prepared some talking points, but we want this to feel natural and spontaneous." Her voice carried a slight hint of something Tyler couldn't quite identify. An accent, maybe, or just the careful modulation of someone who spent most of their time on camera. But there was something familiar about the rhythm of her speech, like an echo of a conversation he'd had years ago. "Natural and spontaneous," Tyler repeated. "Got it." Theo had positioned himself behind the camera equipment and was already making exaggerated hand gestures that Tyler chose to ignore. "I'll get you set up with a microphone," Vanessa continued, moving toward a small table covered in audio equipment. She picked up a wireless mic pack with the same efficiency she'd applied to the lighting. "If you could just—" "Oh, this is where it gets good," Theo Stage whispered from across the room. "The intimate miking process, very romantic." Tyler shot him a look that could have frozen the rink, but Vanessa seemed completely unaffected by Theo's commentary. She approached Tyler with the microphone, maintaining a careful distance that felt both professional and oddly deliberate. "This clips to your shirt," she explained, demonstrating with her own mic already attached to her blazer lapel. "Try to avoid touching it during filming. It picks up fabric noise." She reached toward his collar to attach the microphone, and Tyler caught a hint of something subtle, not perfume, but maybe the faint scent of whatever shampoo she used. Her movements were quick and efficient, but he noticed how she positioned herself to minimize contact, like she'd performed this routine 1,000 times, but never with him specifically. "Testing, testing." Grace's voice crackled through the speakers as Vanessa stepped back. "Both mics are live and clear." Tyler adjusted the small transmitter pack clipped to his belt and looked around the studio again. The setup was more elaborate than he'd expected. Multiple camera angles, professional lighting, and enough equipment to broadcast live if needed. "Ready when you are," Vanessa announced, taking her position in front of the main camera. Tyler moved to stand beside her, and Theo immediately started making elaborate kissy faces from behind the equipment. "So we're just going to have a conversation?" Tyler asked. "A guided conversation," Vanessa corrected, consulting the small tablet in her hands. "I'll ask questions designed to highlight your personality and team chemistry. Just respond naturally, and we'll edit together the best moments." Something in her tone suggested that naturally came with very specific parameters. "First question," she continued, looking directly into the camera with a kind of poise that suggested years of on-air experience. "Tyler, what drew you to hockey originally, and how has that passion evolved during your time with the Vipers?" Tyler blinked. They were just jumping straight into it, apparently. I started playing because my older brother played. Thought it looked fun, exclamation point. "And how has that initial interest developed into the professional dedication we see today?" The question felt like it had been crafted by committee, designed to elicit a specific type of inspirational response.
Tyler could practically see the soundbite Grace was hoping for, something about growth and commitment that would play well in highlight reels.
It's still fun, he said instead. Most days.
Vanessa's smile never wavered, but Tyler caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe? Or annoyance at his deliberate simplicity.
What aspects of team chemistry do you think are most important for success? She continued smoothly. Showing up when it matters.
Behind the camera, Theo was nodding enthusiastically and giving Tyler encouraging thumbs up, apparently, delighted by his refusal to elaborate. Can you expand on that? Vanessa pressed, and Tyler realized she wasn't going to let him get away with non-answers. Hockey's not complicated, Tyler said, warming to the challenge. Either you trust the guy next to you or you don't. Either you're willing to take a hit to make a play or you're not. Everything else is just talking. Interesting perspective. Her voice remained perfectly modulated, but Tyler caught the slight tilt of her head as she processed his answer. How do you build that kind of trust with teammates? You don't build it. It's just there or it isn't. But surely there are specific experiences or moments that strengthen team bonds.
Tyler studied her face, looking for cracks in the professional facade.
She was good, better than most reporters at maintaining control of an interview. But he could sense her frustration with his deliberate resistance to her script. Maybe, he conceded, but those moments aren't the kind you can plan for a camera. For just a second, Vanessa's composure slipped. Her eyes sharpened and Tyler caught a glimpse of something more genuine underneath all that polish. Intelligence, probably. Determination. And maybe a hint of annoyance at his refusal to play along.
That's an interesting point, she said, recovering quickly. Can you give us an example of an unplanned moment that strengthened your connection with the team?
Tyler glanced toward Theo, who was now making elaborate romantic gestures and pointing between Tyler and Vanessa with both hands. How about we talk about something else? Actually, this line of questioning is really productive, Vanessa replied smoothly. Our audience appreciates authentic insights into player relationships. The word authentic, delivered with that level of media-trained precision, made Tyler want to push back harder. What if I don't feel like being authentic for your audience? The temperature in Studio B seemed to drop several degrees. Vanessa's smile remained perfectly in place, but Tyler could see her recalculating her approach in real time.
Of course we want you to be comfortable, she said. But the campaign is designed to showcase the personal side of our players. Fans want to connect with the people behind the jerseys. Do they? Or do they want a version of us that's been edited and packaged for their consumption? End quote. Behind the camera, Theo had stopped making jokes and was watching the exchange with genuine interest. Even Grace had gone quiet, apparently sensing that her carefully planned interview was veering off script. Vanessa set down her tablet and looked directly at Tyler for the first time since they'd started filming. What would you prefer to talk about? The question caught him off guard. Not because she'd asked it, but because it sounded like she actually wanted to know the answer. I don't know, Tyler admitted. Something real, maybe? Real is more difficult to control, Vanessa said quietly, and Tyler wondered if she'd meant for the microphone to pick that up. Yeah, he agreed. It is. They stood there for a moment, the studio silent except for the hum of electronic equipment. Tyler found himself studying Vanessa's profile as she appeared to consider their options, still bothered by that nagging sense of familiarity. There was something about the way she held herself, or maybe the line of her jaw, that tugged at his memory like a half-remembered dream. But every time he tried to focus on the feeling, it slipped away. Let's try a different approach, Vanessa said finally, turning back to the camera. Grace, can we review what we have so far? Absolutely! Grace's enthusiasm returned full force. I'll pull it up on the monitor. Vanessa moved toward the equipment station, leaving Tyler standing in the bright lights. He watched her navigate the technical setup with the same precision she'd shown adjusting the cameras, and found himself wondering what she was like when she wasn't performing for an audience. You're doing great, Theo called out helpfully. Very mysterious and brooding. The fans are going to eat this up. Tyler ignored him and focused on Vanessa, who was now scrolling through footage on her tablet with a small frown. Whatever she was seeing apparently wasn't meeting her standards. When filming resumed, she returned to her position beside him, but something had shifted. The questions were still professional, still designed for specific sound bites, but Tyler sensed a different energy underneath, like she was testing him as much as interviewing him. Let's talk about growth, she said, her eyes meeting his instead of focusing on the camera. What's changed about your approach to the game over the past few years? It was still a media-friendly question, but the way she asked it felt more direct, less scripted.
Tyler found himself actually considering the answer instead of planning his next deflection.
I used to think it was about proving something, he said slowly. Now I think it's about protecting something.
What kind of something?
Things that matter, people who matter. He paused, surprised by his own honesty. The game matters, but it's not everything.
Vanessa nodded, and Tyler caught a flicker of understanding in her expression. Like maybe she knew exactly what he meant. The boy,
That's a mature perspective, she said. When did you start thinking about hockey that way?
when I realized that everything else I cared about was more fragile than I thought.
The answer hung in the air between them, more personal than Tyler had intended to get. But something about the way Vanessa was listening, really listening, not just waiting for her next cue, had made him forget about the cameras for a moment.
That sounds like experience talking, she said quietly.
Yeah, it is.
Behind the camera, even Theo had gone quiet, apparently sensing that something genuine was happening. Tyler found himself looking at Vanessa instead of the lens, studying the intelligence in her dark eyes and the way she seemed to weigh every word before speaking.
And that nagging feeling of recognition was back, stronger than before. Like standing on the edge of remembering something important, but not being able to take the final step.
Let's take a short break, Vanessa announced, stepping away from the cameras. I want to review the footage and make sure we're capturing the right tone. ... She moved back to her tablet, effectively dismissing Tyler from her attention. But he found himself lingering anyway, watching as she scrolled through the interview clips with the focused concentration of someone who never left anything to chance.
Whatever story she was trying to tell, Tyler was beginning to suspect it involved a lot more than team chemistry and personal growth. The question was whether he was supposed to be reading between the lines or whether she was just that good at keeping her cards hidden.
Either way, he was starting to think that underneath all that professional control, Vanessa Quinn might be hiding something significant. And somehow he couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to know what it was. Chapter 3. Clutch Move. Vanessa claimed the corner table at Cafe Clutch 15 minutes before Riley was supposed to arrive, positioning herself with her back to the brick wall where she could watch both the entrance and the barista station. Her laptop sat open to a spreadsheet that she wasn't actually reading, and her coffee had gone cold 10 minutes ago while she rehearsed conversations she desperately hoped never to have.
Tyler Monroe doesn't recognize me. He has no reason to connect. Vanessa Quinn, media coordinator with Nessa Kim, figure skater. Different name, different life, different everything.
The mental pep talk wasn't working. Every time she tried to focus on the numbers in front of her, her mind drifted back to that moment in Studio B when Tyler had looked at her with that puzzled expression, like he was trying to solve a problem he couldn't quite identify.
She reached for her coffee, grimaced at the temperature, and checked her phone for the third time in 5 minutes. No new messages from Grace, which should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. Grace's enthusiasm for authentic storytelling had a way of uncovering details that were supposed to stay buried. The cafe's front door chimed, and Riley Tran appeared with her usual sleek efficiency, scanning the room until she spotted Vanessa's corner table. She wore a black blazer over dark jeans, her hair in its signature sharp bob, and carried the kind of impossibly small purse that somehow contained everything necessary for any crisis. Riley slid into the opposite chair without ceremony, immediately cataloging Vanessa's tense posture and untouched coffee with the practiced eye of someone who'd been managing her best friend's emotional disasters for years.
I'm ordering an extra shot, Riley announced, flagging down the nearest server, for whatever crisis we're managing today.
There's no crisis, Vanessa said automatically, then caught Riley's skeptical look. Okay, there's a potential situation that requires some strategic thinking. Riley ordered her coffee and settled back in her chair with the patient expression of someone who'd heard this exact disclaimer many times before. Start from the beginning, and try not to leave out the parts that are making you stress-eat your cuticles. Vanessa glanced down at her hands and realized she'd been unconsciously picking at her nail polish. She clasped her hands together and forced herself to speak in measured, professional tones. I've been assigned to lead a new campaign for the team. It's called First Crush Throwback, and it's designed to highlight player personalities through nostalgic interviews about early hockey memories. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I'm paired with Tyler Monroe.
Riley's eyebrows rose slightly, but she stayed quiet, letting Vanessa continue.
Grace Whippy pitched it. She's the new media intern, very enthusiastic about engagement metrics and viral content. The concept's fairly straightforward. We interview players, but their first experiences with hockey, childhood heroes, that sort of thing, build emotional connection with fans.
And the problem is?
Vanessa took a breath.
Tyler and I, we might have crossed paths before. Years ago. Before either of us worked for the team.
Cross paths how?
It's complicated. Vanessa fidgeted with her laptop, closing the spreadsheet she hadn't been reading. We were both involved in youth sports programs around the same time. Different sports, but there was some overlap in training facilities and competitions.
Riley's coffee arrived, and she took a slow sip while studying Vanessa's face. You're spiraling because you think he'll recognize you, aren't you?
The directness of the question hit like a slap. I'm not spiraling. I'm being cautious.
Vanessa! Riley's voice carried the gentle patience of someone who'd been through this conversation in various forms over the years. I've known you since college. You only get that particular line between your eyebrows when you're trying to control something that's fundamentally uncontrollable. What aren't you telling me?
Vanessa stared at her cold coffee, weighing how much truth she could afford to share. Riley knew about the skating career, knew about the injury and the messy end to her competitive dreams, but she didn't know about the coach who'd made headlines for all the wrong reasons, or about how Vanessa's name had been splashed across sports blogs for 3 brutal weeks before she'd legally changed it and disappeared from the figure skating world entirely.
My skating career is ancient history, she said finally. It has nothing to do with my current life or my job with the team. I just don't want unnecessary complications.
Riley set down her cup and leaned forward slightly.
Secrets have a way of becoming explosive when they involve famous people and cameras. You know that, right?
Before Vanessa could respond, her phone buzzed against the table. Grace's name appeared on the screen with a text message that made Vanessa's stomach clench.
OMG, check this out. Rough Cut is so good. Link attached. Can't wait for your feedback. Vanessa opened the link with trembling fingers, and the preview thumbnail loaded immediately. Her blood turned to ice. There, in the small preview window, were silver figure skates laced up to mid-calf, caught mid-spin against pristine white ice. The image was clearly professional, clearly from a competition, and clearly recognizable as belonging to someone who'd been very, very good at what they did.
Excuse me,
Vanessa managed, standing so abruptly that her chair scraped against the floor. I need to use the bathroom. And
Riley's eyes narrowed, but she waved Vanessa away. Go. But we're finishing this conversation.
the cafe's bathroom was cramped and poorly lit, but it offered enough privacy for Vanessa to lean against the locked door and play Grace's video with shaking hands. The opening sequence was standard team footage, players arriving at the arena, glimpses of practice, shots of the crowd. But then Grace's editing style kicked in and archival footage began weaving through the narrative like a perfectly crafted story. Youth hockey leagues transitioned into professional highlights. Childhood photos dissolved into current team shots. And there, at the 2-minute mark, were 10 seconds of competitive figure skating footage that Grace had somehow sourced from old sports archives. The skater was anonymous in the clip. No name caption, no identifying information. But Vanessa recognized every detail. The silver costume, the precise footwork, the way the skater's ponytail caught the arena lights during a triple combination jump. It was from Nationals, 3 years before the injury, when Vanessa had been skating under her birth name and still believed that Olympic dreams were achievable. Her hands were steady as she called Grace, but her pulse hammered against her ribs. Vanessa! Grace's voice was bright with excitement. Did you see the rough cut? I think we've really captured something special with the nostalgic angle. Grace, I need you to pull some of the archival footage. Vanessa kept her voice level, professional. I've identified some potential copyright issues with a few of the skating clips.
Oh, no, really? Which ones?
The figure skating sequences around the 2-minute mark. I'm not sure we have proper licensing for competitive footage, and I'd rather not risk any legal complications, end quote. Totally understand. I have tons of other awesome content anyway. I'll swap those out with some vintage hockey footage I found. Actually, there's this amazing shot of a youth league championship that would work perfectly. That sounds ideal, Vanessa interrupted gently. Can you make those changes before sending the next version to Coach Danvers? Already on it. Should I send you the updated version later today? Perfect. Thanks for being so flexible. Vanessa ended the call,
and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to lean against the bathroom wall and breathe. Crisis averted, for now. But she was becoming uncomfortably aware that each successful dodge was like playing whack-a-mole with increasingly higher stakes.
When she returned to the table, Riley was scrolling through her own phone, but looked up immediately, reading Vanessa's expression with unsettling accuracy. "Whatever you just handled," Riley said quietly, "it's not going to stay handled forever." Vanessa settled back into her chair, reaching for her cold coffee despite knowing it would taste terrible. "I managed a minor editing issue with the campaign video. It's fine." "Vanessa?" Riley's voice carried a gentleness that somehow felt worse than direct confrontation. "Maybe it's time to tell him the truth."
The suggestion hit like a physical blow, and Vanessa felt her carefully constructed defenses snap into place. "Absolutely not! My past identity would only complicate things unnecessarily. Some doors are better left closed."
Are they, though?
Riley tilted her head, studying Vanessa with the expression she wore when she was about to say something Vanessa didn't want to hear. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like keeping those doors closed is taking more energy than you can sustain."
I can handle this.
"I know you can. That's not the question." Riley finished her coffee and signaled for the check. "The question is whether you should have to."
They sat in silence while Riley paid, the weight of unfinished conversation settling between them. Vanessa opened her laptop again, staring at the spreadsheet without seeing any of the numbers, acutely aware of how exhausting it was to maintain constant vigilance against threats that could emerge from any direction.
Outside the cafe, they paused on the sidewalk, and Riley turned to face her with that particular expression that meant she was about to deliver one of her observations that would stick like a splinter under Vanessa's skin.
You know.
Riley said, adjusting her purse strap. "The energy you're spending on hiding might be better used on living." The words hit with devastating accuracy, and Vanessa found herself momentarily speechless, watching her best friend walk away with the confident stride of someone who'd just delivered exactly the truth she'd intended to share. Alone on the sidewalk with her laptop bag and her carefully guarded secrets, Vanessa was forced to acknowledge what she'd been trying to ignore. Her control was more fragile than she'd like to admit, and the foundation she'd built her new life on was showing dangerous cracks. But admitting that didn't mean she was ready to do anything about it.
Not yet. Chapter 4. Studio B Showdown. Studio B felt smaller every time Ty walked into it, like the walls were slowly closing in with each forced media appearance. The ring lights created harsh shadows that made everything look too bright and too fake, which seemed fitting for whatever torture Grace had planned today. Theo was hunched over the sound equipment, poking at buttons like he knew what he was doing, which he definitely didn't. Grace hovered nearby with her ever-present clipboard, taking notes about God knew what, and looking like Christmas morning had arrived early.
"Ready for round 2 of emotional torture?" Theo announced without looking up, his grin audible even from behind the soundboard.
Ty dropped his gear bag with more force than necessary. "I thought you had practice."
"Traded shifts with Rodriguez? Wouldn't miss this for the world." Theo straightened up, wearing the expression of someone who was about to enjoy himself far too much at Ty's expense. "Plus, Grace asked me to help with the technical stuff." Grace beamed at this, which told Ty everything he needed to know about how well the technical stuff was going to go. "Theo's been amazing. He suggested some really creative lighting options for today's shoot." "Creative," Ty repeated flatly, already regretting every decision that had led him to this moment. He should have hidden in the equipment room. Hell, he should have called in sick. The door opened with its usual slight squeak, and Vanessa walked in with her laptop bag and that professional composure she wore like armor. But something was different today. Her movements were more controlled, more deliberate, like she was concentrating on appearing normal. She checked her notes, then checked them again, adjusted the camera angle, moved it back, made a small notation on her tablet that seemed to require unusual focus. "Everything okay?" Ty found himself asking, which surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise her. "Fine," she said quickly, then softened it with a smile that looked genuine but felt rehearsed. "Just want to make sure we get everything right today." Theo clapped his hands together. "All right, lovebirds, let's get this romance novel started. I've got some ideas about dramatic lighting that'll really sell the whole—" "We're not filming a music video," Vanessa interrupted, but her tone lacked its usual edge. "Yet," Theo said with dangerous enthusiasm.
But I've been watching some behind-the-scenes footage from reality dating shows, and there are definitely some techniques we could...
Absolutely not. This time, Vanessa's voice had returned to its normal, crisp authority.
Ty settled into the chair across from hers, noting that she'd positioned the cameras differently today, closer, somehow more intimate. The wireless mic felt heavier than usual when she clipped it to his shirt, her fingers brushing against the fabric with professional efficiency that still managed to make him hyper-aware of the contact.
"Mic check," she said, already moving back behind the camera.
"Testing, testing," Ty said into the microphone, keeping his voice deliberately flat.
"Perfect," Theo announced from behind the soundboard. "Really captures that brooding, mysterious vibe. Maybe lean into the moody lighting a bit more? I adjusted the side spots to create more shadows."
"The lighting is fine as it is," Vanessa said firmly.
"But what if we dimmed the key light just a touch? Create more romantic atmosphere."
I read this article about how professional photographers...
"Theo!" Ty's voice carried enough warning to make his teammate grin wider.
Right. I'll just monitor the audio silently, like a professional."
The chances of Theo doing anything silently were approximately 0. But Vanessa was already settling behind the camera with her notes, that tightly controlled energy radiating off her in waves that Ty couldn't quite interpret.
"Ready when you are," she said, and the red recording light blinked off.
The first few questions were standard team dynamics stuff. How long he'd been with the Vipers, his role on the ice, what he liked about playing in Midland. Safe territory that let him fall back on the responses he'd given a dozen times before. But even the familiar questions felt different coming from her. More pointed, somehow. Like she was listening for something specific beneath his answer.
"Let's talk about community engagement," Vanessa said, consulting her notes. "The team does a lot of outreach work. What's that experience been like for you?"
"Part of the job," Ty said, then realized how dismissive that sounded. "I mean, it's good. Important. Any particular events that stand out? Moments that felt especially meaningful?" There was something in the way she phrased it, a careful emphasis that made him look at her more closely. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but her pen was clicking rhythmically against her clipboard in a way that seemed unconscious.
"There have been a few," he said slowly. "Why?"
"Just curious about what resonates with you outside the game itself." She glanced at her notes again. "I know there was a youth showcase event back when we were teenagers, before either of us went pro. Something with young athletes demonstrating their skills, I believe. Inspiring moments, that kind of thing." The words hit differently than he'd expected them to. Young athletes, inspiring moments, the specific time frame. The phrasing felt deliberate, like it should mean something to him.
And it did.
The memory surfaced in fragments, pieces of a day he hadn't thought about in nearly a decade. A crowded rink filled with excited kids and teenagers, their voices echoing off the walls. He'd been there as part of a junior hockey league exhibition, 17 and already carrying the weight of expectations. Most of it was a blur of handshakes and photos and questions about his future plans.
But there had been something else. Someone else. A girl in silver skates who moved across the ice like she was dancing with the air itself. Her dark hair had caught the arena lights as she demonstrated jumps and spins for the younger kids, each movement so precise it looked effortless. Poetry in motion. That's what his grandmother would have called it. He'd stopped to watch, forgetting about the scheduled meet and greet activities, mesmerized by the way she made the ice look like it belonged to her. "You remember it," Vanessa said, and it wasn't a question. Ty realized he'd been staring at her while the memory crystallized, his expression probably giving away more than he intended. The pieces were there, but they wouldn't quite fit together, like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
"Some of it," he said carefully.
Ooh, we're getting somewhere.
Theo stage whispered from behind the soundboard, leaning forward with obvious interest. The comment broke Ty's concentration, reminding him that he was sitting in front of a camera with a microphone clipped to his shirt, probably looking like he was having some kind of revelation that made no sense to anyone watching. "What I remember," he continued, trying to regain his footing, "is that there were a lot of talented kids there. Good energy. But what did those moments of connection with young athletes mean to you?" Vanessa asked. And there was something in her voice now, a subtle tension that made him feel like this question mattered more than the others. The honest answer surprised him. Instead of reaching for a generic response about giving back to the community, he found himself actually thinking about it. About why that day had stuck with him when so many media obligations blended together into forgettable noise. "I guess," he paused, aware that his mic was still recording, but somehow not caring as much as usual.
Those kids didn't know about my reputation yet. They just saw someone who played hockey, and that was enough. They weren't waiting for me to screw up or say the wrong thing.
The words came out before he could stop them, more honest than anything he'd said into a microphone in years.
Most of the time, I feel like people see me as the guy who's one bad headline away from suspension. But those kids, they just wanted to know if I like playing hockey. And for once, I got to talk about the parts of the game that actually matter to me.
He could hear himself rambling, could feel the familiar weight of saying too much, but something about Vanessa's focused attention made it impossible to retreat back into safe media speak.
I wanted to be useful for something other than fighting, he continued. Wanted to feel like hockey could be something bigger than just managing my reputation. The truth of it hit him as he said it. That's what he'd been missing. Feeling useful beyond his worst moments. Being seen as more than the sum of his penalties.
Vanessa's expression shifted during his answer, something flickering across her features that looked almost like recognition, before she quickly masked it, but not quickly enough. He caught the change, saw the way her pen stopped clicking, noticed how her careful professional composure wavered for just a second,
like his words had hit a nerve she hadn't expected him to find.
For once, even Theo stayed quiet, seeming to recognize that something real was happening in the space between the cameras and the controlled lighting. The studio felt different, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with Grace's romantic atmosphere suggestions and everything to do with the sudden absence of pretense.
Ty felt simultaneously exposed and oddly relieved. When was the last time he'd answered a question honestly instead of strategically? When had he last talked about what mattered to him instead of what was safe to admit?
That's... Vanessa started, then stopped, looking down at her notes like she was trying to find her next question.
That's a really thoughtful perspective.
Is it?
He was still watching her face, trying to decode the expression that had flickered across it. You looked surprised. She glanced at the camera, then back at him. I think people don't always expect that level of introspection from athletes, especially in media settings.
It was a diplomatic answer, but it didn't explain the way she'd reacted to his words about young athletes and inspiring moments. Didn't explain why he felt like they were having two conversations at once. The one being recorded and another one happening in the spaces between words.
Should we move on to the next question? She asked, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before.
Sure, he said, though he found himself reluctant to leave whatever territory they'd accidentally wandered into.
Grace's voice cut through the moment from somewhere behind the cameras. Oh my God, that was incredible. The authentic emotion, the vulnerability. This is exactly what we need for the campaign. Ty had forgotten Grace was there, forgotten that everything he just said was being recorded for public consumption. The realization should have made him panic, should have triggered his usual instinct to backtrack or deflect. Instead, he just felt tired. Tired of monitoring every word, tired of performing a version of himself that felt increasingly disconnected from who he actually was.
Was that okay? He asked Vanessa and was surprised to realize he genuinely wanted her opinion.
She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. It was honest, she said finally. That's more than okay. But something in the way she said it made him think she wasn't just talking about his answer, made him think that honesty was something she understood the value of and maybe the cost of better than most people.
Should we keep going? He asked.
Let's take a quick break, she decided, reaching over to turn off the camera. Give Grace a chance to review what we have so far. As the red recording light blinked off, Ty found himself still watching Vanessa's face, still feeling like he was missing something important. The fragments of memory from that long-ago fan event kept circling, refusing to form a complete picture, but carrying an emotional weight he couldn't quite explain. The girl in silver skates. The way she'd moved like the ice was home, the feeling that he'd witnessed something rare and beautiful. And the nagging sense that it connected to this moment, to this room, to the woman sitting across from him, with secrets in her eyes.
Chapter 5. The Observation Rink.
The ceiling of her apartment had 47 water stains. Vanessa knew because she'd counted them twice since midnight, their brown edges mapping out familiar shapes against the cracked plaster. A bird, a lightning bolt, her old skating coach's disapproving frown.
Her mind refused to shut down even though her body ached with exhaustion. Muscles tight from 12 hours of managing crisis interviews and dodging Tyler's searching looks. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Ty's voice from the studio. That raw honesty about wanting to inspire young athletes, about feeling useful beyond his reputation.
The way he'd looked at her when he said it, like he was searching her face for something she wasn't ready to give.
Her sheets had gone cold hours ago, kicked off and tangled around her ankles. The digital clock's red numbers burned into her retinas. 2:04, 2:11, 2:15. Each minute stretched longer than the last, filled with the phantom echo of skate blades and the weight of secrets she'd carried for too long.
At 2:17 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely. The gym bag in her closet seemed to call to her, dusty and forgotten behind winter coats and interview blazers that smelled faintly of arena air and camera lights. She hadn't touched it in 2 years, hadn't even opened it since she'd moved to Midland and convinced herself she could build a life without ice. 6 years since her competitive career had ended with a torn ACL and shattered Olympic dreams, but only 2 since she'd allowed herself any connection to her former life. Her fingers found the zipper anyway, the metal cold against her palm as it revealed the silver figure skates she'd told herself she'd never wear again.
They were exactly as she'd left them, blades still sharp enough to catch the lamplight, leather softened by years of practice, and dreams that had died harder than her torn ACL ever had.
The drive to Keller Arena felt like sleepwalking through a memory. No traffic, no sounds, except the hum of her car's heating system and the whisper of tires on empty streets, still damp from yesterday's rain. Street lights blurred past her windows like fallen stars, each one marking another step away from the safe distance she'd built between herself and the ice. She used her staff keycard to slip through the back entrance, muscle memory guiding her through corridors that looked different in the dark, smaller, more intimate, like walking through the skeleton of something she'd once loved.
The observation rink sat in darkness, emergency lighting casting long shadows across the ice like fingers reaching toward center ice. Someone had resurfaced it recently. The surface gleamed like black glass, unmarked and perfect, holding the promise of a clean slate. The familiar smell hit her immediately, that clean, sharp scent of fresh ice mixed with the lingering ghost of hockey tape and equipment. But underneath it all was something else, something that made her chest tighten with recognition. A metallic bite of possibility, the moment before a routine when anything could happen, and perfection felt just one clean landing away.
Vanessa's hands shook as she laced her skates, fingers fumbling with muscle memory that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. The leather was stiffer than she remembered, the blades duller than they should be, neglected metal that caught the emergency lighting in dull flashes rather than the mirror-bright gleam she'd once demanded of her equipment. How long had it been? 2 years? 3? Long enough that her ankles protested as she stood, the tendons tight and unfamiliar with the precise angle required. Long enough that the weight distribution felt wrong, her center of gravity thrown off by muscles that had forgotten their purpose.
Her first step onto the ice was tentative, wobbly.
The surface that had once felt like home now seemed treacherous beneath her blades, and her body had forgotten how to trust the physics of it, forgotten the way ice responded to pressure and balance, the delicate negotiation between friction and freedom. For a terrifying moment, watching her blades scratch uncertainly across the surface instead of carving clean lines, she wondered if she'd lost it entirely, if all those years of training and competition had simply evaporated, like breath in cold air, leaving her as unsteady as a beginner wobbling through their first lesson.
But then her right blade found its edge, pressed down with the instinctive confidence buried somewhere deeper than conscious thought, pushed off with familiar authority, and suddenly she was gliding. Slowly, carefully, but moving across the ice like she belonged there, like the surface recognized her even if her mind insisted otherwise, like she'd never really left, just been away long enough to appreciate the homecoming.
The rhythm returned gradually, the whisper of steel cutting through silence, that soft shush-chush that had been the soundtrack to her childhood dreams, the gentle push and glide that had once been as natural as breathing, as automatic as her heartbeat. Her body remembered what her mind had tried so desperately to forget,
The way her weight could shift and flow like water finding its level, how her knees could bend to absorb the motion and redirect it into something graceful. The way turning felt like dancing with physics itself, a partnership between intention and momentum that no amount of time away could truly break.
The ice accepted her like an old friend. The familiar bite of cold air against her face, a welcome shock after months of stale arena air from the press box. Each stroke felt easier than the last, muscle memory awakening in her legs and core, each turn more confident as her body remembered rhythms it had carried for years. She'd forgotten this feeling, the way skating could quiet the constant hum of anxiety in her chest, could make everything else disappear until there was nothing but the movement and the hypnotic sound of her blades carving clean lines through the silence. No cameras, no questions, no careful answers, just her and the ice that had never judged her, never asked for explanations or apologies.
She was attempting a lazy figure eight. Nothing fancy, just the simple pleasure of tracing curves when she heard the door open.
The soft click of the latch made her heart stop entirely, the sound echoing through the empty space like a gunshot. She spun toward the entrance, nearly losing her balance as her skates caught an edge, to see a familiar silhouette filling the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, hair messy like he'd run his hands through it repeatedly, a nervous habit she'd noticed during particularly brutal interview sessions.
Ty Monroe stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of concern and surprise that suggested he'd expected to find anything but her. The overhead lights caught the sharp angles of his face, throwing shadows that made him look even more imposing than usual, though something about his posture seemed almost hesitant.
"Oh," he said, his voice carrying easily across the empty rink, rougher than it sounded during press conferences. Sorry, I saw your car in the parking lot and thought something might be wrong." Vanessa's skates scraped against the ice as she came to a complete stop, her breath visible in puffs of white vapor that dissipated quickly in the cold air. Of course he'd seen her car, the little silver sedan that had no business being in the players' lot at this hour. Of course he'd investigate. She probably looked suspicious as hell, sneaking around the arena in the middle of the night like some kind of hockey groupie with a master key.
"Nothing's wrong," she called back, though her voice sounded thin and unconvincing, even to her own ears. The words bouncing off the empty seats and coming back to mock her. "I just couldn't sleep."
"So you decided to skate?" There was no judgment in his tone, just genuine curiosity, tinged with something that might have been understanding. His hands were shoved deep in the pockets of his team-issued hoodie, shoulders slightly hunched against the arena's perpetual chill. Heat flooded her cheeks despite the frigid air, embarrassment warming her from the inside out.
It's not as weird as it sounds. Ozwe and
I didn't say it was weird. He stepped fully into the rink, letting the heavy door close behind him with another soft click that seemed to seal them both into this pocket of quiet. I was just wondering if you wanted me to leave, if this was supposed to be private.
The question hung in the cold air between them, visible almost as another breath cloud. Vanessa should say yes, should claim professional boundaries or personal space, should send him away before he started asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. Before he connected dots she'd spent years keeping separate. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to claim she was just blowing off steam and send him back to whatever sleepless wandering had brought him to the arena at 2:30 in the morning.
Instead, she found herself shaking her head.
"You can stay," she said, surprised by her own words, "if you want."
The distance between the bench and the center of the rink felt both vast and intimate. Far enough that she could keep skating without feeling watched, without the prickle of observation that usually made her hyper-aware of every movement. Close enough that conversation felt natural, private, their voices carrying in the hushed acoustics without either of them having to raise their tone. The dim lighting helped, casting everything in shades of blue-gray that made the space feel separate from the rest of the world, everything softer and less defined than the harsh brightness of the studios where they usually interacted, where every word was measured and every expression calculated for the cameras. Vanessa pushed off again, slower this time, letting herself glide in wide, lazy circles while she tried to figure out what to say. Her skates whispered against the ice, the sound rhythmic and soothing in a way that helped quiet the nervous energy thrumming beneath her skin.
I love hockey rinks, she heard herself admit, the words emerging before she could second-guess them. Always have, the way they smell, that clean ice smell, but also the echo of everything that's happened there. Skates hitting the boards, the sound of a perfectly timed pass, the way the crowd holds its breath right before a goal.
She made a gentle turn, her blade catching what little light filtered down from the observation deck above. The familiar scrape of metal on ice sent a shiver of recognition through her muscles, muscle memory awakening despite the years she'd tried to bury it.
There's this moment before every game starts, when the ice is perfect and anything could happen, like the whole story is waiting to be written. Her voice carried a wistfulness she hadn't intended, a reverence that felt too revealing. The Zamboni's just finished. The surface is glass smooth, and for maybe 30 seconds before the teams take the ice, it's this blank canvas. Pure possibility.
The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, too honest, too unguarded. She'd never articulated those feelings before, never tried to explain why empty rinks called to her, why the smell of ice machinery and the acoustics of an arena could make her chest tight with longing and loss in equal measure, why she found herself here at 2:30 in the morning, chasing something she couldn't quite name.
You sound like you know what you're talking about, Ty said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone she couldn't quite identify. Curiosity, maybe? Or recognition?
The obvious follow-up question hung in the air between them. The one she'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. The natural progression that would lead to territory she'd spent years learning to navigate around.
I skated competitively, she said, testing the words carefully.
A long time ago. Figure skating. Until life got in the way.
It was vague enough to avoid outright lies while still sharing something real, a careful half-truth that felt heavier than it should have.
Must have been serious if you're still this comfortable on the ice.
Vanessa's breath caught, the sound sharp and small in the quiet arena. He wasn't pushing for details, wasn't demanding explanations or timelines like every reporter she'd ever met, just accepting what she'd offered and acknowledging it without making her feel like she owed him more, like her half-truth was enough for now. The unexpected gentleness broke something open in her chest, a crack in the careful armor she'd spent years building. When was the last time someone had listened to her admit something personal without immediately wanting to know everything? When had someone given her space to share only what felt safe, without that familiar, hungry look that meant they were already calculating how to use what she'd revealed?
It was,
she said simply, her voice steadier than she felt, then pushed into another turn to hide the way her throat had tightened. The movement was automatic, muscle memory taking over when emotions threatened to spill past her carefully maintained boundaries. They settled into comfortable silence after that, the kind that felt earned rather than awkward. Vanessa continued her lazy circuits of the rink while Ty watched from the bench, his presence steady and undemanding. Neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with unnecessary words or forced conversation. The only sounds were the whisper of her blades against ice, sharp and clean in the cold air, and the distant hum of the arena's heating system cycling through its ancient rhythms. The longer they sat in the darkness together, the more the boundaries between them seemed to blur. Not the professional ones. Those were still firmly in place, a line she couldn't afford to cross. But something deeper, something that had to do with the kinds of secrets people carried and the weight of stories too complicated to tell all at once. The space between them felt less like distance and more like understanding, as if he somehow knew what it meant to have a past that didn't fit neatly into interview answers.
Eventually, Vanessa found herself attempting one small spin. Nothing elaborate, just a simple rotation that felt like testing whether her body remembered how to find its center. The muscle memory was there, rusty but reliable, and for one perfect moment, she felt completely weightless, completely free. When she glided to a stop near the bench, close enough to see Ty's expression in the dim light, the air between them felt charged with possibility, with the dangerous intimacy of shared secrets, even partial ones,
with the recognition that they were both people who understood what it felt like to be more than the stories other people told about them.
Better than therapy, she said softly, gesturing to the ice around them.
Cheaper too, Ty replied, and the small joke broke some of the tension without destroying the fragile connection they'd built. Vanessa looked down at her skates, at the silver blades that had once been her entire world, then back up at the man who'd somehow made this moment feel safe instead of terrifying. She wasn't ready to tell him everything, wasn't ready to admit who she used to be, or why she'd ended up here. But for the first time in years, she felt ready to stop running quite so fast from the parts of herself she'd left behind.
Chapter 6.
Friendly fire. Ty arrived at the team photo shoot expecting the usual corporate efficiency, a few quick headshots, maybe some action poses, and he'd be back to the locker room within an hour. Instead, he walked into what looked like the set of a daytime soap opera having a nervous breakdown. Grace Whitby stood in the center of Keller Arena's media room with a clipboard pressed against her chest and the manic energy of someone who definitely had too much coffee and not enough sleep. Behind her, a massive backdrop declared Vipers, first Crush Throwback, and swooping script that made Ty's teeth ache just looking at it. The whole thing screamed romance novel meets hockey fantasy, and every instinct he had told him to turn around and walk back out. Perfect timing! Grace spotted him immediately, waving him over with the enthusiasm of a caffeinated wedding photographer who'd been given free rein with someone else's budget. We're just getting started with the couple shots for the campaign finale. Right. Because somehow his life had become the kind of story where he stood in front of cheesy backdrops pretending to be in love for the cameras. Grace clapped her hands sharply, and the sound echoed off the arena walls like a starter's pistol. Okay, everyone, for this next series, I need authentic couple energy, real chemistry, the kind of connection that makes people believe in true love and also buy season tickets. Several teammates were already scattered around the room in various stages of the photo process. Dante Ruiz had claimed a spot near the craft services table, methodically working his way through a box of donuts while observing the chaos with the detached interest of someone watching a nature documentary about particularly dramatic birds. Theo, naturally, had positioned himself right next to Brick, where he could provide maximum commentary with minimum effort. He caught Ty's eye and made an exaggerated swooning gesture, pressing the back of his hand to his forehead like a Victorian lady about to faint. More romance, less murder face, Theo called out helpfully as Grace began arranging Ty and Vanessa near the backdrop. Remember, you're supposed to be falling in love, not plotting each other's demise. Vanessa appeared beside him, wearing her professional smile, the one she used during press conferences when reporters asked particularly stupid questions. It was bright and practiced and didn't reach her eyes, which were currently focused somewhere over Ty's left shoulder. Wonderful, Grace chirped, circling them like a shark who'd caught the scent of content potential. Now, Vanessa, I need you to put your hand right here on Ty's chest. Yes, like that. And Ty, gaze longingly into her eyes. Think deeply in love, but trying to play it cool for the cameras. Ty felt like a Ken doll being manipulated by an overeager child. Grace positioned his arms, adjusted his stance, and tilted his head at an angle that probably looked romantic from the photographer's perspective, but felt ridiculous from his. This is it, Theo announced to no one in particular. This is how dignity dies, in matching jerseys under fluorescent lighting. Brick shook his head slowly, the movement somehow conveying both sympathy and mild amusement. He'd pulled out his phone and was either texting or pretending to text to avoid being dragged into the spectacle himself. Hold that pose, Grace commanded, and the photographer's camera started clicking in rapid succession. Vanessa's hand pressed against his chest, warm through the thin fabric of his jersey. But her shoulders were rigid with tension. Her smile never wavered, but up close, you could see the strain around her eyes, the careful control that suggested she was counting seconds until this particular torture session ended.
Perfect. Now lean in a little closer. Yes! Feel the chemistry!
The whole situation was absurd enough that Ty felt his natural impulse towards sarcasm kick in. Maybe if he could get Vanessa to laugh, some of that tension would ease and they could both stop feeling like contestants in a particularly embarrassing game show. I feel like we're modeling for a romance novel cover, he muttered, pitching his voice low enough that the photographer wouldn't pick it up. Something called Puck Me, I'm Dreaming. Instead of the laugh he'd been hoping for, Vanessa's expression tightened.
The professional smile flickered, replaced by something that looked almost like panic, and she stepped back from him abruptly, breaking the pose and leaving his comment hanging in the air between them, like a failed joke in a funeral.
"I need a minute," she said, her voice carefully neutral, but her eyes avoiding his completely.
"Let's take a quick break," Grace called out, apparently sensing the shift in energy. 5 minutes, everyone. Hydrate and check your makeup."
Vanessa practically fled toward the bathroom, her professional composure intact, but her steps just a little too quick to be casual. Ty watched her go, confusion and something that might have been hurt settling uncomfortably in his chest.
"Smooth move, Romeo." Theo sidled up with a knowing grin that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of development. Really swept her off her feet with that one. I'm pretty sure she's swooning in the bathroom right now.
Shut up, Theo.
Just saying, your romantic comedy timing could use some work. Maybe next time try flowers instead of hockey puns. Ty shot him a look that usually made rookies reconsider their life choices, but Theo had known him too long to be intimidated. Instead, his teammate just shrugged and wandered back toward the donuts, whistling what sounded suspiciously like the wedding march. 20 minutes later, after they'd finished the rest of the shoot with stilted professionalism and carefully maintained distance, Ty found Vanessa in the team lounge. She'd claimed a corner table and was typing furiously on her laptop, her posture screaming, "Do not disturb," to anyone with basic social awareness.
Unfortunately for both of them, Ty's social awareness had never been his strongest skill.
He approached her table slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal that could either flee or attack depending on his next move.
"Hey." She looked up briefly, her expression polite but guarded.
Hey.
"About earlier, the photo thing. I was just trying to lighten the mood, but I think
It's fine." She cut him off with a dismissive wave, her attention already returning to her laptop screen. Professional hazard of working with athletes. Everyone's a comedian. The comment stung more than it should have. Probably because there was just enough truth in it to land. But something about her rigid posture, the way she was gripping her laptop like a shield, made him think this wasn't really about his failed attempt at humor. "I saw you skating the other night," he said, switching tactics and hoping for more honest ground. "In the observation rink, you looked like you belonged out there." Her fingers paused over the keyboard for just a moment before resuming their rapid clicking. "I told you, I skated when I was younger."
Right, but that was more than just casual skating. That was...
He searched for the right words, remembering the grace and precision he'd witnessed, the way she'd moved like the ice was her natural element. "That was professional level. You competed, didn't you?" "I dabbled in figure skating when I was younger." Her voice was carefully controlled, the same tone she used when deflecting questions during press conferences. "It's ancient history now."
Ancient history.
The phrase felt deliberately chosen to shut down further conversation, and the fact that she still hadn't looked at him since he'd sat down was starting to grate against his nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Dabbled," he repeated, letting skepticism color his voice. "That's what you call what I saw."
"I call it none of your business." The words were sharp enough to draw blood, delivered without her ever lifting her eyes from the screen.
Ty felt his patience fraying like an old rope under too much weight. Every time he tried to have a genuine conversation with her, every attempt to connect beyond the surface-level banter they managed during interviews, she threw up walls and deflected like her life depended on keeping him at arm's length.
"What are you so afraid of?"
The question came out rougher than he'd intended, frustration bleeding through his careful control. "Every time we talk about anything real, anything that matters, you shut down like I'm asking for state secrets." Finally, she looked at him. But instead of the anger he'd expected, her expression was careful and distant, like she was looking at a stranger who'd accidentally wandered into her workspace. "I'm not afraid of anything. I just don't see the point in relitigating my past for your entertainment." Entertainment? The word hit him wrong, stirring up something hot and defensive in his chest. "You think that's what this is, isn't it?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the cool assessment she usually reserved for difficult interview subjects. The brooding hockey player wants to solve the mystery of the evasive media coordinator. It's very compelling. Very romantic comedy meets investigative journalism. The casual dismissal felt like a slap, reducing their conversation in the observation rink, the tentative trust they'd started building, to nothing more than his curiosity and her inconvenience, like she was filing him under mildly interesting distraction instead of someone who might actually give a damn about her as a person. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, filled with all the things neither of them was saying. Vanessa's fingers had stopped moving over the keyboard, but her eyes remained fixed on the screen like it contained the secrets of the universe instead of whatever emails she'd been crafting.
You know what? Ty pushed back from the table, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that felt appropriately harsh for the moment. You're right. Ancient history. Got it.
He started to walk away, then turned back, unable to leave it completely alone.
For what it's worth, I wasn't asking because I thought it would be entertaining. I was asking because I thought maybe you might want someone to know who you actually are instead of just who you're pretending to be.
Vanessa's shoulders tensed, but she didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his words beyond the slight tightening of her grip on the laptop.
I have urgent emails to answer, she said quietly, effectively dismissing him with the kind of professional politeness that felt more cutting than outright hostility.
Ty recognized the brush-off for exactly what it was. He'd been on the receiving end of enough variations to know when someone was done with a conversation. Done with him, done with whatever messy emotional territory they'd accidentally wandered into. Walking away from the lounge, Ty found himself caught between frustration and something that felt uncomfortably like hurt. He understood being private, understood not wanting to share every detail of your past with people you barely knew. Hell, he'd built his entire public persona around saying as little as possible to as few people as necessary.
This felt different. This felt like Vanessa was deliberately keeping him at a distance, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't think he was worth trusting. Like she'd decided he was exactly the kind of person who would use her history for entertainment or gossip fodder, and nothing he said or did would convince her otherwise. The part that bothered him most was that he couldn't entirely blame her for the assumption. His reputation wasn't exactly built on emotional sensitivity or respectful personal boundaries. If you looked at his media coverage, his penalty statistics, his general approach to dealing with people who annoyed him, you'd probably come to the same conclusion she had. But the person he'd been in the observation rink, the person who'd sat quietly while she skated and shared something real, that wasn't an act. That wasn't him trying to solve a puzzle or satisfy his curiosity. That had been him recognizing something in her that felt familiar. Something that made him want to understand the gap between who she was in front of the cameras and who she was when she thought no one was watching. Apparently she didn't see it that way.
Walking through the arena corridors toward the locker room, Ty couldn't shake the image of Vanessa's rigid shoulders, the way she'd held herself like someone bracing for impact. Whatever she was protecting, whatever she was so determined to keep hidden, it mattered to her in a way that went deeper than simple privacy.
The problem was, the more she deflected, the more he wanted to understand why someone as confident and controlled as Vanessa Quinn became evasive and defensive every time their conversation turned personal, especially when it involved her past on the ice.
He wasn't sure if that made him curious or just a glutton for punishment. Chapter 7. Skate and switch. The black cocktail dress felt like armor, but not the good kind. More like the kind that was too tight in all the wrong places, and made breathing a deliberate act rather than something that happened naturally. Vanessa adjusted the neckline one final time before stepping through the entrance to the Keller Arena's transformed event space, mentally cycling through her usual collection of small talk responses. How's the campaign going? Wonderfully, the team's been so supportive. What's it like working with professional athletes? They're incredibly dedicated and professional. Any exciting upcoming projects? Always exploring new ways to showcase the team's community involvement. Safe, boring, utterly forgettable responses that would carry her through handshakes and brief conversations without anyone remembering she'd been there 5 minutes after she walked away. Which was exactly how she liked it. The ballroom hummed with the kind of controlled chaos that came with putting hockey players in formal wear and asking them to make nice with donors. Vanessa spotted several teammates clustered around the bar, already loosened ties and slightly rumpled dinner jackets, giving away their discomfort with anything that wasn't jeans and team-issued polos. A few of the wives and girlfriends moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of people who actually belonged at events like this,
while the players themselves looked like they were serving community service hours.
She checked her phone discreetly, scrolling through Grace's Instagram story updates. The intern had been documenting every detail of the evening with the enthusiasm of someone who thought charity galas were basically red carpet events. So far, the posts were harmless. Shots of the silent auction table, a few group photos of players with their dates, some artfully arranged appetizers that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Everything proceeding smoothly. No media disasters. No awkward questions. No one asking her to elaborate on background details that didn't fit the narrative she'd carefully constructed.
Progress.
Vanessa accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and positioned herself near the registration table, close enough to look engaged with the event but far enough from the main conversation clusters to avoid getting drawn into anything more substantial than pleasantries. From here, she could monitor the room, keep an eye on social media, and hopefully make it through the evening without incident.
The sound cut through the ballroom chatter like a blade through silk. A laugh that was too bright, too practiced, too familiar. Vanessa's blood turned to ice as she turned toward the source, already knowing what she'd see but praying she was wrong.
She wasn't. Elise Fontaine glided toward her through the crowd in an ice blue gown that probably cost more than Vanessa's monthly rent, her signature smile sharp enough to cut glass. Every step was choreographed, every gesture calculated for maximum impact. Just like when they were 17 and competing for the same spots on the national team.
Some things never changed.
Nessa, what a delicious surprise.
The nickname hit her like a physical blow, and Vanessa's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized Elise was about to use her old skating identity in front of a room full of hockey players, reporters, and team management. In front of people who might recognize the name, might start asking questions, might connect dots that would unravel everything she'd built.
Elise, how lovely to see you, Vanessa interrupted quickly, moving to block Elise's view of the nearby guests while frantically hoping her former rival would take the hint about maintaining distance. Her voice came out steady and professional, but she could feel the tremor in her hands as she gripped her water glass.
Elise's eyes glittered with predatory amusement, the same look she used to get right before landing a particularly difficult combination in competition. Back when they were teenagers, that look usually meant Elise was about to do something spectacular and slightly reckless that would make the judges forget whatever routine had come before hers. Now, it just meant danger.
I was just telling some people about all those years training together, Elise continued, her voice pitched just loud enough for nearby conversations to pause. Such fond memories of our competitive days, the early morning practices, the travel, the pressure, you know how it is. Across the room, Ty stood with Theo and a few other teammates, but Vanessa could feel his attention shift toward their conversation. She caught him watching the interaction with growing confusion, noting her rigid posture and the way she kept glancing around as if looking for an escape route from what should be a friendly encounter between old friends.
Which it absolutely was not.
That was a long time ago, Vanessa said carefully, trying to inject warmth into her voice while simultaneously willing Elise to take the hint and move on to literally anyone else in the room. I'm sure you have much more interesting projects these days.
Oh, I do. Elise leaned closer, close enough that her whisper wouldn't carry beyond Vanessa's ears.
Still keeping secrets, I see. How very professional of you.
The words landed like a punch to the stomach. Elise knew. Of course she knew. She'd probably known the moment Vanessa's name started appearing in Vipers' media coverage, had probably been waiting for exactly this opportunity to demonstrate that she still held all the power she'd had when they were competing.
Some things really never changed.
I don't know what you mean, Vanessa said, but even she could hear how hollow the denial sounded. Her old roommate could probably read her panic from across the room. Don't you? Elise's smile widened, revealing perfectly white teeth that looked exactly like they had 15 years ago. I think we should catch up properly. I'd love to hear about your transition from the ice to this. She gestured vaguely toward the hockey-themed decorations and team logos scattered throughout the venue. Such a fascinating career pivot. I'm sure everyone here would find your backstory absolutely captivating. The threat was delivered with the same sweet smile Elise used to wear during interviews, back when reporters asked about rivalry and competition and whether the pressure ever got to her.
She'd perfected the art of saying one thing while meaning something entirely different, and right now she meant that Vanessa's carefully constructed anonymity was hanging by a thread that could be cut whenever Elise decided it suited her purposes.
I have some urgent campaign duties to handle, Vanessa said desperately, already backing away from the conversation. Excuse me.
She practically fled toward the nearest bathroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that sounded uncomfortably like panic. Behind her, she could hear Elise's laugh following her retreat, bright and delighted and absolutely venomous.
The bathroom was mercifully empty, all marble surfaces and soft lighting that was probably designed to be flattering, but mostly just made everything feel surreal. Vanessa gripped the edge of the sink and stared at her reflection, trying to steady her breathing and repair her composure. Her hands shook as she reapplied lipstick, the simple action feeling monumental when her fine motor skills seemed to have abandoned her entirely. In the mirror, she looked exactly like what she was, someone who'd been ambushed by their past and was barely holding it together.
Elise's unexpected appearance had shattered her carefully maintained control like a rock through glass. All the preparation, all the mental rehearsal, all the safe responses she'd practiced. None of it mattered when the person threatening her anonymity was someone who knew exactly which buttons to push and how hard.
3 deep breaths. Fix the lipstick. Straighten the dress. Walk back out there and pretend everything was fine.
She could do this. She'd been doing this for years.
The problem was, she wasn't 17 anymore, and the stakes were higher than competition rankings and national team selections. This was her entire adult life, her career, her identity. Everything she'd built since leaving competitive skating could crumble if Elise decided to start sharing stories about their shared past.
And from the look in her former rival's eyes, that decision was uncomfortably close to being made.
Returning to the gala felt like walking back into enemy territory, but Vanessa forced herself to move with purpose rather than the panic that was still coursing through her system. She spotted Elise immediately. It was hard to miss that ice blue gown and the way she commanded attention without seeming to try.
She was chatting animatedly with Grace near the silent auction table.
Vanessa's stomach plummeted as she caught fragments of their conversation drifting across the room.
Fascinating backstories that never get told. Untold athlete journeys. Such rich material for content creation. ... Grace was nodding enthusiastically, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement she usually reserved for viral TikTok trends and engagement metrics that exceeded projections. She was taking notes in her phone, occasionally glancing around the room as if she was already planning how to incorporate whatever insights Elise was sharing into future campaign materials.
This was worse than a disaster. This was a complete catastrophe wrapped in ice blue silk and delivered with a smile that could have powered the arena's lighting system.
But Vanessa knew better. She also noticed Grace's newfound interest in asking probing questions about her, quote, diverse background in winter sports whenever they crossed paths during the evening. Questions that hadn't existed an hour ago, before Elise had started planting seeds about fascinating backstories and untold journeys.
Vanessa, I've been thinking,
Grace said during one such encounter, practically vibrating with enthusiasm. We should totally do a deep dive into your skating background, like a whole retrospective series. The fans would eat it up, and it would add so much depth to your on-camera presence with the players.
I'm not sure that would be very interesting, Vanessa managed, trying to keep her voice light and dismissive.
Ancient history, really.
Are you kidding? It would be amazing. I met someone tonight who said you were actually really competitive back in the day. Like, seriously competitive. Grace's eyes were shining with the particular fervor of someone who thought they'd stumbled onto content gold. She mentioned something about nationals and exhibitions. Vanessa, why didn't you tell me you had this whole other athletic career?
Because athletic careers ended. Because some doors, once closed, needed to stay that way. Because the person she built on the ice wasn't someone she could afford to be anymore. Because Elise Fontaine had just reminded her exactly why she'd left that world behind in the first place.
It was a long time ago, Vanessa repeated, but she could tell Grace wasn't buying the deflection any more than Elise had.
The intern was already planning, already envisioning the content possibilities, already seeing Vanessa's carefully guarded past as raw material for the kind of personal storytelling that made campaigns memorable, which was exactly what Vanessa couldn't afford to happen.
Across the room, Ty was still watching her with that same confused expression he'd worn during their encounter with Elise.
Even from a distance, she could tell he was putting pieces together, trying to reconcile the poised media coordinator he knew with the person who'd practically fled from a simple conversation with an old friend. The evening stretched ahead of her like a minefield, every conversation a potential detonation, every smile from Elise a reminder that her past was no longer her secret to keep. Chapter 8. Off the record.
Ty had been driving the familiar route home from downtown for the better part of 2 years, but tonight something made him slow down as he passed Cafe Clutch. Maybe it was the way the streetlight caught a flash of burgundy fabric on the outdoor bench, or maybe it was the defeated curve of shoulders that looked too familiar for comfort, the kind of familiar that reached past his usual instinct to keep driving and mind his own damn business.
He pulled over before he'd fully processed the decision, parking his truck with the kind of precision that came from years of split-second reactions on the ice. The engine's rumble died into the quiet downtown street, leaving only the distant hum of late-night traffic and the soft buzz of the cafe's neon sign. The figure on the bench didn't look up at the sound of his door closing, which confirmed what he'd already suspected, and made something twist uncomfortably in his chest.
Vanessa Quinn sat hunched over her phone, still wearing the cocktail dress from the gala, but looking nothing like the composed professional who'd navigated the evening's social minefield with practiced ease. Her carefully styled hair had come loose from its elegant updo, dark strands falling around her shoulders in a way that made her seem smaller, more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. The burgundy fabric of her dress had wrinkled where she'd been sitting too long, and her heels, those impossibly high ones she'd worn to tower over half the league's executives, lay abandoned beside her bare feet on the cold concrete.
She looked like someone who'd been holding it together through sheer force of will and had finally found a place where she could let that facade crack. The sight hit him harder than he expected, like taking a clean check to the boards when you thought you were in open ice.
Ty approached slowly, his dress shoes clicking against the sidewalk in a rhythm that should have announced his presence. Each step echoed off the surrounding buildings, a steady percussion that felt too loud in the quiet aftermath of the gala. The sound reminded him of skates on fresh ice during morning practice, deliberate, purposeful, impossible to ignore. It wasn't until his shadow fell across the bench that Vanessa looked up, and what he saw on her face made something twist uncomfortably in his chest.
Exhaustion lined every feature, from the smudged makeup under her eyes to the tight set of her mouth. Her usual polished composure had cracked, like ice under pressure, revealing the person underneath. But underneath the fatigue was something rawer, a barely contained panic that reminded him of rookies who'd just taken their first big hit and were trying to convince themselves they could still skate. The kind of look that said the world had shifted sideways and they weren't sure which way was up anymore.
"Mind if I sit?" he asked, settling onto the bench before she could protest. The metal was cold through his suit pants, and he could feel the chills seeping through the fabric as he shifted to face her. From his jacket pocket, he produced Grace's emergency donut box, the pink pastry container that had somehow ended up in his possession during the evening's chaos, probably when Grace had thrust it at him during one of her frenzied organizational moments, with breathless instructions about morale emergencies and strategic sugar deployment.
He opened the lid and held it out with a kind of casual gesture that invited participation without demanding explanation. The sweet scent of glazed sugar and fried dough wafted between them, incongruously comforting against the backdrop of concrete and streetlights. Rough night? ?
The question hung between them, simple enough that she could answer however she wanted. Or not at all, if that's what she needed. He'd learned that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone who was falling apart was just sit there and let them know they didn't have to hold it together for your benefit.
Vanessa stared at the box for a moment, then let out a laugh that sounded more like a release of pressure than actual amusement. The sound was brittle, like glass about to shatter. But there was something genuine in it, too.
"I can't believe you have Grace's emergency donut stash."
She handed it to me when I was leaving, said something about emotional support carbohydrates and never know when someone might need them. Ty watched Vanessa select a glazed donut with fingers that trembled slightly, the motion careful and deliberate, like she was handling something fragile. Guess she was right. The first bite seemed to ground her somehow, bringing color back to her cheeks and straightening her posture just enough that she didn't look quite so much like someone who'd been through a blender.
Her shoulders lost some of their rigid tension, and when she spoke again, her voice had regained some of its usual control, that crisp, professional cadence he'd grown accustomed to during their media sessions.
The gala got complicated.
It was the kind of understatement that said everything and nothing, delivered with the same careful neutrality she used when deflecting tricky interview questions. Ty recognized it for what it was, a test. She was seeing how much he'd push, how many questions he'd ask, whether he was the type of person who respected boundaries, or the type who steamrolled through them in pursuit of information. He'd watched her deploy this exact tone with reporters who got too personal, that polite but impenetrable wall that left them with quotes but no real answers.
He'd gotten enough forced confessions on the ice to know the difference between someone who wanted to talk and someone who needed space to find their words. The guys who swung first usually had the most to say once they stopped throwing punches, but the ones who went quiet, they needed patience.
Complications have a way of doing that, he said instead, settling back against the bench in a way that suggested he wasn't going anywhere, but also wasn't going to demand details she wasn't ready to share. He stretched his legs out slightly, hands loose on his knees, the picture of someone with all the time in the world.
The night air carried the scent of her perfume, something light and professional that probably cost more per ounce than his monthly coffee budget, mixed with the lingering sweetness of glazed sugar from the donut. It was an oddly domestic combination, intimate in a way that their previous encounters had never quite managed. All their other conversations had happened in media rooms or hallways, places with cameras and audiences, and the constant awareness that someone was always watching. Here, with just the distant hum of traffic and the soft glow of street lights filtering through the trees, it felt different, quieter, more real.
Vanessa took another bite, chewing thoughtfully, her gaze fixed somewhere past his shoulder like she was organizing her thoughts or deciding how much truth she could afford to share. When she finally started talking, the words came in carefully measured phrases that revealed just enough to explain her current state without giving away whatever larger truth was eating at her.
Sometimes people from your past show up when you're least prepared for them.
Her hands moved as she spoke. Small, precise gestures that emphasized points or punctuated thoughts, the same elegant economy of movement he'd noticed during press conferences, except softer somehow, less practiced. And they have this way of making you remember why you made certain choices in the first place.
Ty found himself studying those hand movements, something about their economy and grace nagging at the edge of his memory like a melody he couldn't quite place. There was something almost choreographed about the way she gestured, as if her body had been trained to express meaning through motion in ways that went beyond casual conversation.
Professional pressures, she continued, her tone growing more distant. Unexpected encounters, the delicate balance of maintaining your image while dealing with people who remember you before you became that image.
She spoke about it like she was analyzing someone else's situation, maintaining just enough clinical distance to keep her emotions in check. But Ty could see the effort it took, the way her jaw tightened when she touched on certain phrases, the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned people from the past.
And then there is the question of how much control you actually have over your own narrative when someone else holds pieces of your story. The words came out sharper than she'd probably intended, revealing the frustration underneath her composed analysis. When she finally stopped talking and looked at him, really looked at him as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time all evening, surprise flickered across her features. Something shifted in her expression, the analytical distance dissolving into something more unguarded, more real. The careful mask she'd worn throughout dinner seemed to slip just enough for him to catch a glimpse of the person underneath all that composed professionalism.
"Thank you for not asking 20 questions," she said. And the simple gratitude in her voice carried more weight than any of the polished phrases she'd used during their media sessions. It was the kind of thanks that came from someone who wasn't used to being given space to work through her thoughts without having to defend or explain them. The words settled between them with an honesty that felt almost fragile after all the careful choreography of their evening.
The sincerity of it hit him harder than he'd expected, settling somewhere in his chest with an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the comfortable night air. Most people wanted explanations from him, why he'd thrown that punch, Why he couldn't just smile and play nice for the cameras. Why everything had to be so damn complicated. But here she was, thanking him for doing the exact opposite, for letting her complicated thoughts exist without demanding she package them into something digestible.
Vanessa reached into her purse, movements more fluid now that some of the tension had eased from her shoulders. The rigid set of her spine had relaxed, and she no longer looked like she was bracing for impact with every breath. When she pulled out his water bottle, the one with a slightly dented cap that he'd been carrying around for months, Ty realized he'd completely forgotten leaving it behind at their table during the evening's chaos.
"You left this," she said, holding it out to him.
The gesture was simple, practical, but something in the careful way she'd remembered it, the way she'd thought to bring it with her, made it feel like more than just returning forgotten property.
Their fingers brushed as she placed the bottle in his palm, and what should have been a simple transfer of property became something else entirely. Her skin was warm against his, soft in a way that caught him off guard, and instead of pulling away immediately, her fingers lingered for just a moment longer than necessary. The contact sent a jolt of awareness through him that had nothing to do with the cool metal of the bottle, and everything to do with the way she was looking at him. Not like Tyler Monroe, the enforcer, not like the guy with a reputation, but like someone worth seeing.
The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, and the kind of tension that had been building slowly through weeks of shared media sessions and careful conversations. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, and Ty could hear the soft catch in her breathing that suggested she was as affected by their proximity as he was.
He found himself leaning closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her expression and the way the streetlight caught the gold flecks in her dark eyes. Everything about her in this moment contradicted the composed professional he thought he knew. Her guard was down, her walls temporarily lowered, and the person underneath was someone he desperately wanted to know better.
But even as he felt the pull to close the distance between them, something in her expression made him pause. Underneath the longing he could see clearly written across her features was a flicker of something else. Fear, maybe, or uncertainty about whether this was what she actually wanted, or just what the night and her emotional state were making feel inevitable. Ty had learned enough about reading people in pressure situations to recognize when someone was reacting from circumstances rather than genuine choice. And whatever was happening between them, whatever this could become, he wanted her to choose it because she wanted him, not because she was feeling cornered by a difficult evening in his proximity. So instead of closing the distance, he pulled back gently, settling against the bench with the kind of patience that suggested he could wait as long as she needed to figure out what she actually wanted from this moment. The water bottle sat between them now, a tangible reminder of the connection they'd just shared and the restraint he'd just chosen to exercise. Vanessa's fingers curled slightly where his touch had been, and when she looked at him again, there was something like surprise in her expression, as if she wasn't used to men who pulled back when they could have pushed forward.
The night stretched around them, full of unspoken possibilities and the quiet understanding that whatever this was between them, it was worth taking the time to get right.
Chapter 9. Studio Breakdown.
The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but Vanessa couldn't bring herself to stop scrolling through Grace's latest audio compilation. Studio B felt smaller at this hour. The overhead lights dimmed to that uncomfortable fluorescent buzz that made everything feel slightly off-kilter. She'd volunteered to review the footage herself, told Grace she wanted to ensure quality control before any content went live. But really, she just needed to make sure there weren't any surprises lurking in the dozens of hours of recorded material. Grace had gotten enthusiastic with the wireless mics lately, clipping them on anyone within a 10-foot radius of a camera and letting them roll during breaks, setup, and casual conversations. It was exactly the kind of authentic behind-the-scenes content that tested well with focus groups, but it also meant hours of audio that could contain anything from Theo's inappropriate commentary to players discussing trade rumors to...
Vanessa's finger froze over the fast-forward button as her own voice filled the studio speakers, clear and unguarded in a way that made her stomach drop.
"I had to walk away from competitive skating after the injury ended everything!" Exclamation point.
The words hit her like a punch to the chest, even though she remembered saying them. It had been during a break between takes, when she'd thought the mics were off and Grace was occupied with adjusting camera angles. Riley had asked, again, why she didn't just tell Ty the truth, and Vanessa had finally let some of her frustrations spill out in what she'd assumed was private conversation.
But of course, Grace's mics had been rolling. Of course they had. Panic flooded Vanessa's system as she realized the full scope of what this meant. The conversation had continued for several minutes, with her mentioning training injuries, competitive pressure, and the way everything had fallen apart after her ACL tear. She'd been careful not to use her old name, but there was enough detail in her voice, enough pain and specificity that anyone who knew anything about competitive figure skating could piece together the timeline. Her hands shook as she navigated the audio editing software, desperately searching for the delete function among the cluttered interface that Grace had customized with what appeared to be 17 different organizational systems. The timeline showed her voice continuing for another 3 minutes, discussing how she'd reinvented herself in sports media because she couldn't bear to leave the athletic world entirely, but couldn't handle being on the ice anymore. Why had she been so careless? Why had she assumed Grace would turn off the mics just because they were between official takes? The girl documented everything. Her whole job was built around capturing spontaneous moments and authentic interactions. Of course she would have left the audio running. Vanessa finally located what she hoped was the delete function and selected the entire segment of conversation, her cursor hovering over the button as she calculated whether removing this much audio would leave an obvious gap in the timeline. But there was no choice. She couldn't let this reach Grace's final edit, couldn't risk someone else hearing her inadvertent confession about her skating past. She clicked delete just as the studio door swung open behind her. Thought you might need caffeine reinforcements. Ty's voice carried the easy friendliness that had been developing between them over the past few weeks, and she could hear the smile in it even before she spun around to face him. He stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups from the coffee cart that parked outside the arena, his expression shifting from casual warmth to something sharper as he took in her wide-eyed panic, and the way she'd instinctively positioned herself between him and the computer screen, like she was protecting state secrets. What are you deleting? The question came out carefully neutral, but Vanessa could see him processing the guilty terror written all over her face and the defensive hunch of her shoulders. Nothing important, she said too quickly, reaching behind her to close the audio editing program without looking. Just cleaning up some redundant files. Grace tends to record everything in triplicate. I imagine but Ty was already stepping closer, and she realized with growing dread that he was close enough to have heard something. The studio's acoustics were designed to carry sound clearly, and her recorded voice had been playing at full volume when he'd walked in. Even if he'd only caught fragments, it might have been enough. Audio files, he said slowly, and there was something in his voice that made her blood run cold. About skating careers and injuries. She watched confusion flicker across his features first. That same look he'd given her a dozen times over the past weeks when something about her triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. But this time, instead of fading, the confusion deepened into focus. She could practically see his mind working, sifting through fragments of memory and connecting them to new information. "You know a lot about figure skating," he said. Not a question, but a realization. The way you talk about it sometimes, the technical terms you use. It's not just research. It's experience. His eyes narrowed slightly as more pieces aligned. And that day by the practice rink, you looked at the ice like you were seeing a ghost. Vanessa said nothing, but her silence was confirmation enough. The defensive way she stood, her body angled between him and the computer as though she could physically protect her secret, told him everything he needed to know. "There's been something familiar about you since we met," he continued, each word coming slower as the picture formed more clearly. "Something I couldn't place, the way you move maybe, or something about your eyes when you're focusing on a problem." And then she saw it happen, that final connection clicking into place as memory aligned with present reality. His expression shifted from confusion to stunned recognition, his eyes widening as he truly saw her for the first time. "Christ," he breathed. And then his voice took on a quality she'd never heard before, quiet and certain, and somehow full of hurt. "You're Nessa. Nessa Kim." The old shortened version of her name hit her like a physical blow. Not Vanessa,
the composed media coordinator who had her life under control, but Nessa, 17 years old and desperate to prove herself worthy of the Olympic training program. Silver skates, laced tight and heart full of dreams that would shatter, along with her knee 6 months later.
Her defensive walls slammed into place with the force of a lifetime's practice at emotional self-protection.
Don't call me that.
That's who you are, though, isn't it?
Ty took another step closer, and now he was close enough that she could see the way his expression had hardened into something she didn't recognize. The girl with the silver skates who used to wait after our events. The one who always had that serious look, like she was planning her next routine even when she was supposed to be watching hockey.
You don't know what you're talking about.
But even as she said it, Vanessa knew her cover was blown. There was too much certainty in his voice, too many details that only someone who'd actually been there could remember.
You've been lying to me this entire time.
It wasn't a question, and the flatness in his voice was somehow worse than if he'd been shouting. Oh, those conversations about trust, about being real with each other, and you've been carrying around this massive secret like I'm some kind of stranger who can't be trusted with basic facts about your life.
Vanessa felt cornered and exposed, and her brain defaulted to the attack patterns that had protected her through years of media scrutiny and personal disappointment.
Oh, that's rich, coming from you, like you're some paragon of honesty. How many interviews have I watched you give where you perform some carefully crafted version of the Ty Monroe brand? At least my image management doesn't involve getting into fights with reporters.
That's completely different, and you know it. His voice was rising now, the careful control he usually maintained slipping as her accusations hit their mark. I never pretended to be someone else. I never lied about my name or my history or...
You spent 3 years playing the role of the angry enforcer because it's easier than letting people see who you actually are, Vanessa shot back, her own voice climbing to match his. Don't lecture me about authenticity when your entire persona is performance art.
Ty's face went hard, in a way that should have warned her to stop. But she was too far gone now, too desperate to deflect attention from her own exposed secrets, to recognize the danger in pushing him further.
At least I don't lie to people who are trying to trust me.
The words came out with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to hit back where it would hurt most. At least I don't build relationships on completely false foundations and then act like the other person is the problem when they find out the truth.
My past is none of your business! The words ripped out of her with years of accumulated shame and defensiveness behind them. What happened to me, what I had to give up, the way everything fell apart, that's not something I owe you just because we've had a few nice conversations.
Nice conversations? Ty stared at her like she'd slapped him. Is that what you think this has been? A few nice conversations? But Vanessa was spiraling now, completely caught up in the familiar pattern of lashing out when she felt trapped. I didn't ask for you to get invested. I didn't ask for you to show up with coffee and act like we're friends. I certainly didn't ask for you to... She caught herself before she could say whatever that emotion was that had been building between them, but the implication hung in the air anyway.
So what then?
His voice had gone deadly quiet now, but she could see the hurt underneath the anger, and somehow that made everything worse. The skating, the injury, the way you completely rebuilt your life, was any of that real, or was it all just another performance?
Of course it was real.
The words came out as a scream, and she realized she was crying now, tears of frustration and terror streaming down her face. It was the most real thing that ever happened to me, and it nearly destroyed me, and I've spent 6 years making sure no one could ever use it against me again.
Use it against you?
Ty looked genuinely confused now, some of the anger fading as he tried to understand what she was actually afraid of. Why would you think I would...
But Vanessa couldn't hear him over the roar of her own panic and rage, because everyone always does eventually. Because being Nessa means being the girl who couldn't handle the pressure, who got injured and gave up instead of fighting through it. Because being Nessa means being vulnerable and broken and not good enough, and I can't. I won't be her again.
You think that's what I see when I look at you? The question came out so quietly, she almost missed it, but the pain in his voice cut through her panic like a blade. You think I see someone broken and not good enough? For a moment, the fight went out of her, and she was just tired, bone-deep exhausted from carrying around this secret and pretending to be someone she wasn't. But then she looked at his face and saw the way he was looking at her like she was a stranger, and her defenses slammed back into place. You hide behind your enforcer reputation because you're too scared to let people see who you really are underneath? She heard herself say, the words cruel and calculated and designed to hurt. At least I reinvented myself into someone better. You just lean into being the worst version of yourself because it's easier than risking anyone seeing you're actually decent.
The moment the words left her mouth, she wanted to take them back. She could see them land like physical blows, could see the way Ty's face went completely blank as her attack hit every insecurity she'd watched him struggle with over the weeks they'd been working together.
But it was too late. The words were out there, hanging between them like poison, and she couldn't call them back no matter how desperately she wanted to.
Ty went deadly quiet, looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before, like she was a complete stranger.
You know what? His voice was flat now, completely emotionless in a way that was somehow worse than any shouting could have been. I thought I was starting to see who you really were underneath all the professional polish. I thought I was getting to know the real Vanessa, or Nessa, or whatever you want to call yourself.
He paused at the door, not even looking back at her as he delivered the final blow.
But apparently I was wrong about that too.
The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the empty studio, leaving Vanessa alone with her shattered secret and the hollow realization that she'd just destroyed the best thing that had happened to her in years. All because she was too scared to trust someone with the truth about who she used to be.
Chapter 10.
The fallout. Freeze. The arena was empty when Ty arrived, 30 minutes before the team's usual pre-practice time. He dumped his gear bag on the locker room floor with more force than necessary and pulled out his stick, methodically unwrapping a fresh roll of tape like his life depended on getting every wind perfectly even. The rhythmic motion should have been calming. He'd done this thousands of times. Wrap, pull tight, overlap, repeat. But his hands were moving too fast, too aggressive, and he had to start over twice when the tape bunched up under his grip.
You hide behind your enforcer reputation because you're too scared to let people see who you really are underneath.
He yanked the tape tighter, jaw clenched so hard his molars ached. 24 hours since Vanessa had lit him up in Studio B, and her words were still ricocheting around his skull like a puck off the boards. The worst part? She wasn't wrong. Not entirely. He did use his reputation as armor, let people see the penalty minutes instead of anything deeper. But coming from her, someone who'd been lying to his face for weeks, it felt like getting sucker punched by someone he thought was on his side.
Early start today, Monroe?
Ty looked up to find Dante pushing through the locker room door, gym bag slung over one shoulder. The big defenseman took in Ty's thunderous expression and the mangled tape job on his stick without comment, but his dark eyes lingered for a beat too long.
Couldn't sleep, Ty muttered, starting the tape over again. More teammates filtered in over the next few minutes. First Theo, then a handful of the younger guys, all of them shooting him curious glances that he pretended not to notice. He'd perfected the art of looking busy and unapproachable, and today he cranked it up to 11.
He was pulling on his shoulder pads when Grace Whitby bounced into the locker room like a caffeinated golden retriever, tablet clutched to her chest and a smile that could power the arena's lighting system.
Morning, everyone. Quick reminder that we have the follow-up promo shoot scheduled for this afternoon, so if you could... Her gaze landed on Ty, and her smile somehow got even brighter. Perfect. Tyler, I adjusted the script based on yesterday's feedback, and I think you're really going to love the new direction where...
No! The word came out flat and final, cutting through Grace's enthusiasm like a blade through tissue paper. She blinked at him, clearly processing the unexpected response.
I'm sorry, no what?
No promo shoot. Find someone else.
Ty yanked his practice jersey over his head with enough force to test the seams.
But we can't find someone else. You're literally the face of the campaign.
The whole concept is built around you and Vanessa working together to you.
Then scrap the concept.
He grabbed his helmet and headed for the door, but Grace scrambled after him, tablet nearly slipping from her grip. Tyler, please, I know yesterday's session ran a little long, but if there's something about the format that isn't working, we can absolutely make adjustments. The engagement metrics have been incredible so far, and the fan response to your authentic moments has been...
Grace?
The warning in his voice made her stop mid-sentence. Drop it. He pushed through the door to the tunnel, leaving her standing in the locker room, looking like someone had just told her Santa Claus wasn't real. Through the glass, he could see Theo patting her shoulder consolingly while shooting worried looks in Ty's direction. Practice should have helped. Physical exhaustion usually quieted the noise in his head, turned the volume down on whatever was eating at him until he could think straight again. But today,
Every drill felt like he was fighting through mud, his timing off just enough to notice. He was coming off the ice afterwards, sweat cooling under his gear, when Coach Danvers appeared in his path like a human roadblock.
Monroe, office, now.
The coach's tone suggested this wasn't a request, and the scowl on his weathered face promised that whatever conversation was coming wouldn't be pleasant. Ty followed him down the corridor to the cramped office that smelled like old coffee and disappointment.
Danvers shut the door and folded his arms across his chest, the kind of stance that meant someone was about to get their ass handed to them.
You want to explain to me why my media coordinator looks like she's about to cry, and my intern is running around the building asking if we have backup players for a campaign that's supposed to launch next week?
Ty kept his expression neutral, even though his stomach twisted at the mention of Vanessa looking upset.
I told Grace, I'm not doing any more shoots. She can work around it.
Work around it.
Danvers repeated the words like they tasted bad. Son, you don't get to just opt out of media obligations because you're having a mood. This isn't pee-wee hockey.
It's not about having a mood.
Then what is it about?
The coach's voice rose just enough to remind Ty that this man had been dealing with prima donna athletes since before Ty could tie his own skates. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you had one difficult session with Quinn and decided to throw a tantrum. The urge to defend himself, to explain that this was about more than one difficult session, burned in his throat. But how could he explain that Vanessa had been lying to him for weeks about who she was, that he'd started to trust her, started to feel something real for her, only to find out she'd been playing a role the entire time?
How could he admit that her deception hurt more than it should? That somewhere along the way he'd stopped thinking of their campaign as just another media obligation and started thinking of it as something that mattered?
It's complicated, he said, finally, which was both completely true and utterly inadequate. Danvers stared at him for a long moment, and Ty had the uncomfortable feeling that the old coach was seeing more than he wanted to reveal.
You know what's not complicated?
Your contract, which includes a clause about fulfilling reasonable media and promotional duties. The coach leaned back in his chair, expression softening just a fraction. Look, Monroe, I don't know what happened between you and Quinn yesterday, and frankly, I don't want to know. But this sudden media boycott of yours is generating more attention than the actual campaign ever could. And not the good kind.
Ty's jaw worked as he processed that. Of course his absence would be noticed. Of course people would start asking questions, spinning theories about why he'd suddenly gone AWOL from a campaign that had been getting positive coverage.
The front office is already asking questions, Danvers continued. And if this turns into a story about locker room drama or personality conflicts, it's going to reflect badly on the entire organization, not just you.
The implication was clear. Fix this, or we'll fix it for you. Ty nodded once, sharply, and Danvers dismissed him with a wave.
But instead of heading home, Ty found himself wandering the corridors of the arena, his gear bag slung over his shoulder and his thoughts spinning in circles. He was passing the media offices when Grace appeared in front of him again, this time looking less caffeinated and more cautious.
Tyler, I'm really sorry if I pushed too hard earlier. I know the shoots can be draining, and if there's anything I can do to make the process more comfortable... Grace, it's fine. You're just doing your job.
She brightened a little at that, then seemed to remember something. Oh, before I forget, Vanessa asked me to give this to you. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and held it out. Ty's chest tightened as he recognized Vanessa's neat handwriting on the outside. Just his name, nothing more. His hands were steadier than he expected as he took the note, but Grace had already disappeared back into the offices before he could unfold it.
You want the truth, ask next time.
That was it. 7 words in her precise handwriting, no signature, no explanation, just a terse little message that somehow managed to make him angrier than her entire explosive confession the day before.
Ask next time, like he hadn't tried. Like all those moments when he'd sensed she was holding something back, all those careful questions about her skating background that she'd deflected with practice Ds, like none of that had been him asking.
Like he was the one who'd made it impossible for her to be honest.
The paper crumpled in his fist before he could stop himself.
He smoothed it out again immediately, but the damage was done, creases running through her words like scars. The anger felt cleaner than the hurt, so he held onto it as he stalked back toward the locker room. But when he pushed through the doors, he found most of his teammates had already cleared out. Only a few stragglers remained, and the sudden quiet made the emotions he'd been trying to outrun catch up with him all at once. He dropped onto a bench and stared at the note again,
reading those 7 words until they stopped making sense. Part of him wanted to tear it up, throw it away, pretend this whole disaster had never happened. But his fingers wouldn't cooperate with that plan.
Instead, he found himself remembering the way she'd looked that night at the observation rink, vulnerable and real in a way he'd never seen from her before. The way she'd trusted him enough to skate in front of him, to share pieces of her history, even if she hadn't given him all of it.
Had that been real? Or had it all been part of whatever performance she had been putting on since day one?
You know, sitting there glowering at a piece of paper isn't actually going to make it combust.
Ty looked up to find Theo settling onto the bench beside him, still in his practice gear but with his skates unlaced. The forward's usual grin was notably absent, replaced by an expression of uncharacteristic seriousness.
Thought everyone had left, Ty said.
Most people did.
But you look like someone had run over your dog, so I figured I'd stick around and make sure you weren't planning to do something stupid. Theo nodded toward the note. Bad news?
Ty almost laughed at that.
You could say that.
Want to talk about it?
Not particularly.
They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of the arena's ventilation system and the occasional clatter from the equipment room. Theo is usually good at reading the room, knowing when to push and when to back off. But today, apparently, he was in a pushing mood.
You know, avoiding problems doesn't actually make them disappear, he said, conversationally. It just makes you look like a coward. ...
Jesus, Theo.
What? I'm just saying, you've been skulking around here like someone kicked your dog for 2 days, and now you're refusing to do media stuff with the scary lady. It doesn't take a genius to connect those dots.
Ty's hands clenched into fists. You don't understand the situation.
Then explain it to me.
Theo's voice was calm, but there was an edge underneath it that Ty rarely heard from his usually laid-back teammate. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're acting more hurt than angry, which means this isn't really about whatever professional disagreement you two had.
The accuracy of that observation hit like a punch to the solar plexus. Ty opened his mouth to deny it, to insist that this was about professional boundaries and being lied to and nothing more personal than that.
But the words wouldn't come, because Theo was right. He was hurt. Hurt that the connection he'd thought they were building had apparently been one-sided. Hurt that she'd looked him in the eye that night at the rink and shared pieces of her past while still keeping the most important part hidden. Hurt that when the truth finally came out, she'd used his own insecurities against him like weapons.
And underneath all of that, there was a disappointment that felt too big for what this was supposed to be. They'd been thrown together for a media campaign, nothing more. He shouldn't care this much about her secrets, or her past, or the fact that she'd been playing a role this entire time.
But he did care. More than he wanted to admit, even to himself.
She lied to me, he said finally, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. About who she is, about her past. And when I called her on it, he gestured vaguely at the note.
Theo was quiet for a moment, considering this. Did she lie, though? Or did she just not tell you everything?
What's the difference? ?
Pretty big one, actually.
Theo leaned back against his locker, studying Ty's face.
Look, man, I don't know what happened between you two, but I've seen the way you look at her during those shoots. And I've seen the way she looks at you when she thinks no one's watching. Whatever this is, it's not just professional.
Ty's chest tightened at the implication that what he'd been feeling might not have been completely one-sided after all. But then he remembered the cold calculation in her voice when she'd torn him apart, the way she'd targeted every insecurity she'd figured out about him.
Doesn't matter now, he muttered.
Why? Because you're too proud to admit you might want to hear her side of the story?
Because there's nothing left to hear. But even as he said it, Ty knew it wasn't entirely true. Part of him, a part he really didn't want to examine too closely, still wanted answers, still wanted to understand why she'd hidden her past, why she'd reacted so explosively when he'd figured it out.
Still wanted to know if any of those moments between them had been real.
Theo must have seen something in his expression because his voice gentled slightly. Look, I'm not saying you should just forget about whatever she did, but maybe consider that people don't usually react that strongly unless they're scared of something.
With that bit of wisdom delivered, Theo clapped him on the shoulder and headed for the showers, leaving Ty alone with Vanessa's note and a growing realization that avoiding her wasn't actually making anything better.
The smart thing would be to let it go. To show up for whatever media obligations he couldn't get out of, keep things professional, and pretend that the past few weeks hadn't happened. To go back to being the guy who kept people at arm's length instead of the guy who'd started hoping for something more. But as he sat there in the empty locker room, staring at her precise handwriting, Ty found himself thinking about the way she'd looked when she was skating, free and graceful and completely herself in a way he'd never seen from her before. And he thought about the careful walls she'd built around that part of herself, the way she'd flinched when he'd gotten too close to the truth.
Maybe Theo was right. Maybe people didn't usually guard their secrets that fiercely, unless those secrets could hurt them.
Before he could talk himself out of it, Ty was on his feet and heading for the parking garage. He told himself he was going to her apartment, to demand answers, to get closure so he could move on from whatever this mess was between them. But as he drove through the city streets toward her building, he had to admit that what he was really hoping for was the chance to understand her, to figure out if the woman he'd glimpsed in those unguarded moments was real, or if she'd just been another performance in a life that seemed built on them. Either way, he needed to know. Chapter 11. Apartment Truths. The sharp knock on her apartment door made Vanessa jump so hard she nearly dropped her wine glass, the burgundy liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. She'd been curled up on her couch for the past hour, wearing an oversized Vipers hoodie she'd lifted from the media closet, and trying to convince herself that avoiding Ty for the rest of her natural life was a viable career strategy. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and something about the rhythm, 3 sharp raps followed by silence, made her stomach clench with recognition. She padded to the door in her socks and peered through the peephole, her heart sinking when she saw exactly who she'd expected.
Ty stood in her hallway, his jaw set and his dark eyes carrying the kind of unresolved anger that had been simmering for days. His shoulders were rigid with tension, and even through the distorted fisheye view of the peephole she could see the determined way he held himself. This wasn't a social call.
He was here for answers. Vanessa considered pretending she wasn't home, but the soft glow from her living room was probably visible under the door, and besides, she'd been hiding long enough. With a deep breath that did nothing to steady her nerves, she unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. "Hey," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. "I didn't expect." "We need to talk." His voice was rough, controlled in a way that suggested he was holding back a lot more than he was letting show. When she gestured vaguely toward the living room, he pushed past her polite invitation to sit and planted himself in the middle of her space like he was preparing for battle. Vanessa closed the door and turned to face him, acutely aware of how she must look in her too big hoodie and messy ponytail, her makeup scrubbed off and her defenses scattered somewhere between the wine and the exhaustion of maintaining her professional mask for so long. "Who are you?" The question came out flat and direct, no preamble or small talk to soften the edges. "I mean, really, not the media coordinator, not the woman who clips microphones and schedules interviews. Who are you?" The raw pain in his voice hit her like a physical blow, cutting through all the careful explanations she'd been rehearsing in her head. She opened her mouth to deflect or dodge or offer some sanitized version of the truth, but the words that came out were nothing like what she'd planned. "My name used to be Nessa Kim," she said, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. "I was a figure skater. Elite level. Olympic track. For 15 years, that was the only thing I knew how to be." Something flickered across Ty's face. Surprise, recognition, maybe relief that she was finally telling him something real. But he didn't interrupt, just stood there waiting for the rest of it with that same uncompromising intensity. And for the first time in years, Vanessa found herself wanting to give it to it. "I started skating when I was 4, she continued, sinking down onto the edge of her couch because her legs suddenly felt unsteady. "My parents saw potential, got me the best coaches, the best training. By the time I was 16, I was supposed to be the next big thing, the Korean-American figure skating prodigy who was going to bring home Olympic gold." The words were tumbling out faster now, like a dam had burst somewhere deep in her chest. She'd never told this story to anyone. Not Riley, not any of the handful of people she'd dated since reinventing herself. But something about Ty's stillness, the way he was listening like her words actually mattered.
made it impossible to stop. I had the technique, the artistry, the competitive record. Everyone said I was a lock for the Olympic team. And then 3 months before trials, I tore my ACL during a routine practice session. Just a simple jump I'd done thousands of times before, but I landed wrong and... She gestured helplessly. Everything I'd worked for was gone in about 2 seconds.
Ty's expression had shifted,
The anger giving way to something softer and more complicated. He moved closer, not quite sitting, but perching on the edge of her coffee table so they were at eye level.
The injury wasn't the worst part, though, Vanessa continued, surprised by how much it still hurt to say it out loud. I could have come back from that. Athletes do it all the time. But when I tried to return to competition, I couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The expectations, the media attention, the way everyone was watching to see if I'd lost my edge. I choked in my first competition back. Fell on jumps I could have done in my sleep, couldn't get my head right.
She pulled the sleeves of her hoodie down over her hands, using the fabric as a shield against the vulnerability of finally
Saying these words to someone who might actually understand.
The media coverage was brutal. Failed golden girl who couldn't handle the comeback. Mental weakness disguised as physical injury. They dissected every mistake, every wobble, every time I looked scared on the ice. And the worst part was they weren't entirely wrong. I was scared. Terrified that I'd never be good enough again, that everyone would see through the facade and realize I'd been a fraud all along.
Ty's hands were clenched into fists on his knees, and for a moment, Vanessa thought he was angry again. But then she realized it was a different kind of tension. The kind that came from recognizing something painful in someone else's story.
The silence that followed felt enormous, stretching between them like a chasm she wasn't sure could be crossed.
Vanessa braced herself for him to walk away, to tell her she was a coward or a liar or both. Instead, Ty surprised her by settling heavily onto her couch, his shoulders dropping as some of the fight went out of him.
I know something about having your worst moment define you, he said quietly, his voice rougher than before. The fight that made my reputation, the one that got me labeled as nothing but a violent hothead, it happened because some asshole took a dirty shot at one of our younger guys. Kid was barely 19, first season in the majors, and this veteran just targeted him for no reason other than to send a message.
Vanessa's breath caught, recognizing the parallel even before he spelled it out.
I lost it, Ty continued, staring down at his hands. Completely lost control defending him. And the media spun it like I was just another thug who couldn't handle his emotions, like my protective instinct was evidence that I was nothing but muscle with anger management issues. Never mind that I was trying to protect someone who couldn't protect himself. All they saw was the violence.
He looked up at her then, and Vanessa felt something shift between them, a recognition of kindred spirits who'd both been hiding from their pasts, both carrying shame that didn't entirely belong to them.
They weren't wrong about the violence part, Ty said with a bitter laugh. I did lose control, but they missed everything else about who I am, who I was trying to be, and after a while, it gets easier to just be what they expect than to keep fighting for something more complicated.
The parallels between their stories hung in the air between them, and Vanessa felt tears she hadn't realized were building start to spill over. The relief of finally telling someone the truth, of having it received with understanding rather than judgment, was almost overwhelming.
Hey,
Ty said softly, and then he was reaching across the space between them, his fingers gentle against her cheek as he wiped away tears she couldn't stop. Are you okay? The tenderness in his voice was more devastating than his anger had ever been. For years she'd been braced for people to see through her carefully constructed professional persona and find her lacking. But Ty was looking at her like she was something precious, like her broken pieces were worth handling with care.
I don't know, she whispered, and then his mouth was on hers and she stopped thinking altogether.
The kiss happened without conscious decision, desperate and hungry, and full of months of suppressed longing that had been building between them in studio lighting and fake interviews and stolen moments and empty rinks. Vanessa lost herself in the relief of finally being seen completely by someone who understood what it meant to carry shame, to be reduced to your worst moment on the most public stage possible. They moved together with the urgency of people who'd been emotionally starving, Ty's hands tangling in her hair as he whispered her name, her real name, against her throat. And Vanessa felt herself coming back to life in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Like parts of her that had been frozen since that devastating competition were finally beginning to thaw. "Nessa," he said again, the sound of it making her shiver. No one had called her that in years, and hearing it in his voice felt like reclaiming something she'd thought was lost forever. She pulled back just enough to look at him, to see her own wonder reflected in his dark eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything she'd been too scared to say before. "I'm sorry I lied to you. I'm sorry I made you think."
He pressed his forehead against hers, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "We both made mistakes. We both got scared." And as they sat there in the dim light of her living room, still tangled together and breathing hard, Vanessa realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't performing for anyone. She was just herself, flawed and frightened and real, and somehow, impossibly, that was enough.
Chapter 12.
Final cut. Ty pushed through the conference room door, expecting the usual chaos of mandatory media meetings, but instead found Grace practically levitating with excitement at the front of the room. Her laptop was already connected to the large screen, cables snaking across the table like she'd been setting up since dawn. Teammates filtered in with the resigned expressions of players who knew they were about to endure another round of social media strategy and engagement metrics.
Morning, everyone! Grace chirped, her voice hitting that particular pitch that meant she'd already consumed at least 3 energy drinks. I hope you're ready for some absolutely incredible numbers because, oh my gosh, you guys are not going to believe the response we've been getting. Ty slumped into his usual seat near the back, but his attention immediately zeroed in on Vanessa, sitting across the room. She was perched on the edge of her chair like she might bolt at any second, her shoulders rigid, despite everything that had happened between them the night before. Their eyes met briefly, and he caught the flash of anxiety in her expression before she looked away. The vulnerability they'd shared in her apartment felt fragile in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the conference room, like something that might not survive exposure to the rest of the world. Ty's chest tightened at the thought that she was already retreating behind her professional walls.
"So, as you can see from these engagement charts," Grace continued, clicking through slides that made Theo whistle low under his breath, "the first Crush Throwback campaign has exceeded our wildest projections. We're talking about a 400% increase in social media interaction, trending hashtags across 3 platforms, and fan content that's practically writing itself."
Bodhi leaned back in his chair. Fan content?
Oh, you have no idea.
Grace's grin was borderline manic. "There are entire threads dedicated to analyzing your body language, Ty. And Vanessa, they're calling you the most authentic interviewer in sports media. One tweet said you two have better chemistry than most TV couples." Ty's teammates turned to look at him with varying degrees of amusement, and he felt heat creep up his neck. Across the room, Vanessa had gone entirely still, like she was trying to disappear through sheer force of will. "But the real magic," Grace said, clicking to a new slide, "happened when we started pulling together the final compilation video. I've been reviewing all the footage we've captured over the past few weeks, including some behind-the-scenes moments that were just too good not to include." Ty's stomach dropped. What kind of behind-the-scenes moments? Grace's smile was pure PR professional. "The kind that show authentic connection. Trust me, you're going to love this." She hit play on the video, and the opening montage was familiar. Clips from their various promo segments, carefully edited sound bites about comeback stories and second chances. But something felt different about the pacing, more personal than the polished content they'd been producing. Then, Ty heard it. Audio he definitely didn't remember recording. Vanessa's voice, clear through the room's speakers as she talked about figure skating with the kind of raw honesty she'd only shared with him in private moments. "Competitive skating teaches you to perform perfection," her recorded voice was saying over footage of them in Studio B, "but real life doesn't give you practice runs. When I got injured, I had to learn how to be okay with being imperfect in front of people who'd only ever seen me succeed." Ty's head snapped toward Vanessa, whose face had gone pale as she stared at the screen in horror. This was the audio clip she'd tried to delete, the one they'd fought about. Somehow Grace had recovered it and woven it seamlessly into the campaign narrative.
I walked away from skating because I was afraid, Vanessa's voice continued. Afraid that if people saw me fail, that's all they'd remember about me. But hiding from failure just meant hiding from everything else too.
The room had gone completely silent. Ty's teammates actually paying attention instead of checking their phones or whispering among themselves. Even Theo had stopped his usual running commentary to focus on the emotional arc playing out on screen.
Coach Danvers, who rarely showed emotion about anything that wasn't directly related to hockey performance, was nodding slowly. "Takes guts to come back from that," he muttered. And Ty realized his gruff coach was genuinely moved by Vanessa's story.
The video shifted to show clips Ty didn't recognize, moments that must have been captured by security cameras or forgotten recording devices. There he was, offering Vanessa his water bottle after the gala. There they were, sitting close together in the empty rink, her skates glinting under the arena lights while he watched her with an expression that was unmistakably tender. His stomach lurched as he remembered Grace mentioning the rink had new security cameras. They'd been recorded during what he'd thought was a private moment. Their conversation about fear and starting over captured without either of them realizing it.
Sometimes the best stories aren't scripted, his own voice said through the speakers, and Ty remembered saying those words to Vanessa during one of their late-night talks.
They're just two people being honest about what scares them.
The video concluded with a montage that felt more like a love story than a PR campaign. Intimate shots of them actually listening to each other, laughing at inside jokes, sharing the kind of comfortable silence that only came from genuine connection. It was everything their fake campaign was supposed to simulate, except it was real. As the screen faded to black, the room erupted in surprised approval. Brick was actually applauding, and several teammates were offering genuine compliments about the video's authenticity. "Damn, Monroe," Theo said, grinning. "You two actually look like you like each other."
Best campaign content we've ever produced, Coach Danvers added gruffly. Feels real for once.
Ty barely heard the praise, his attention focused on Vanessa across the room. She was staring at the blank screen with an expression of pure shock, like she couldn't quite process that her story had been received with understanding instead of judgment. The meeting dispersed, gradually, teammates drifting out while discussing weekend plans and upcoming games. But Vanessa remained frozen in her seat until the room was nearly empty, then stood abruptly and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot.
Ty followed, joining her at the window where she stood with her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. Outside, autumn sunlight was turning the asphalt golden, but Vanessa seemed to be staring at nothing.
"You okay?" he asked quietly.
I thought they'd think less of me.
She whispered, her voice small and uncertain.
When they heard about the skating, about why I left, I thought they'd see me as someone who gave up, someone who couldn't handle the pressure.
Ty moved closer, close enough to catch her reflection in the window glass. "Did you hear what they actually said?"
She shook her head, still staring out at the parking lot.
"They said it takes guts to come back from failure. They said your story felt real." He reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. "What you accomplished before your injury was incredible, but what you've built since then, the career you created from scratch, the way you help other people tell their stories, that's even more impressive." Vanessa turned to look at him, and he could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You should be proud of both versions of yourself," he continued firmly. "The one who chased Olympic dreams and the one who found a different way to stay connected to what she loved. Both of those people are worth respecting."
She studied his face with something like wonder, as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "So should you," she said softly. The words hit him unexpectedly hard.
"What do you mean?"
"Your protective instincts, the way you defend people who can't defend themselves, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's something rare and valuable." She squeezed his hand. "Maybe the media got the story wrong, but that doesn't mean you have to hide the parts of yourself that are actually admirable." Before Ty could respond, the conference room door burst open, and Grace practically bounced through it, phone in hand and eyes bright with manic excitement. "Guys!" she announced, breathlessly. "You need to see this! The video has been live for exactly 47 minutes, and it's already gone viral. Like,
actually viral. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of views, trending hashtags, and the comments. Oh my gosh, the comments are incredible.
She thrust her phone toward them, scrolling rapidly through responses that seemed to blur together in a stream of heart emojis and enthusiastic praise.
Look at this one, Grace said, stopping on a particular comment. This is what authentic sports coverage looks like. More media personalities should be this honest about their own journeys. And this one, Tyler Monroe just became my favorite player because of how he listened to her story. And, oh, this is my favorite. These two have restored my faith in genuine human connection.
Ty felt something shift in his chest. A loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for months. For the first time in years, the story being told about him, about both of them, was actually true. Not the simplified narrative of the aggressive enforcer or the polished facade of the perfect media professional, but something messier and more complicated and infinitely more honest.
There's more, Grace continued, still scrolling. Sports journalists are calling it a masterclass in vulnerability, and there's already talk about featuring you both in a longer-form interview series. The network is thrilled, Coach Danvers is thrilled, and I'm pretty sure I'm about to get promoted based on engagement metrics alone. Vanessa was staring at the phone screen with an expression of disbelief, like she couldn't quite process that people were responding to her truth with empathy instead of ridicule.
I don't understand, she said quietly. How are people reacting this positively to a story about failure?
Because it's not a story about failure, Ty realized, the understanding hitting him with sudden clarity. It's a story about resilience, about finding new ways to stay connected to what you love, even when the original path doesn't work out. Grace nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. People are connecting with the honesty, with the idea that setbacks don't have to define you. And the way you two support each other through the vulnerability, that's the kind of authentic relationship content that audiences are craving. Ty looked at Vanessa, who was still processing the positive response to her story. For weeks, he'd watched her carefully control every narrative, every angle, every possible interpretation of her words. But now, her carefully constructed professional persona had been stripped away, and instead of rejection, she was receiving acceptance.
You know what the best part is? Grace added, her excitement bubbling over. This isn't even a fake relationship anymore. Like, obviously, it started as a campaign strategy, but the connection between you two is so genuine that it's basically become a real romance that happens to have incredible PR value. The words hung in the air between them, and Ty felt Vanessa's hand tighten around his. Grace had just articulated something neither of them had been willing to say out loud. Somewhere in the middle of staging authentic moments, they'd created something actually authentic. Grace, Vanessa said carefully, can you give us a minute? Of course! Grace bounced toward the door, pausing only to add, but seriously, you two are media gold. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. After she left, Ty and Vanessa stood alone in the conference room, still holding hands by the window. The silence stretched between them, but it felt different now, less fraught, more full of possibility. So, Ty said eventually, apparently we're media gold. Vanessa laughed, a real laugh that transformed her entire face. Apparently, we are. How do you feel about that? She considered the question seriously, her thumb tracing patterns across his knuckles. Terrified, she admitted, but also lighter somehow, like I've been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. Ty thought of the gala, of Elise Fontaine's calculating smile and veiled threats. Speaking of breathing easier, what about your former skating rival? Still worried she'll expose your past? Vanessa's lips quirked upward. Actually, I called Elise yesterday. Told her I was taking control of my narrative and that she was welcome to share any stories she wanted because I'd be sharing them first. Her eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. Her exact words were, "Well played, Quinn." Then she asked if I'd consider giving her an exclusive interview after the video went public. And? Ty raised an eyebrow. I said yes, but only if I get final edit approval. Vanessa squeezed his hand. Turns out when you stop running from your past, it loses most of its power over you. Ty nodded slowly. Former enemies make strange allies. She's not an ally, Vanessa clarified with a wry smile. But she respects power moves. Taking ownership of my story was apparently impressive enough to make her reassess our dynamics. He knew exactly what she meant. The constant vigilance of protecting his reputation, of monitoring every interaction for potential misinterpretation,
had been exhausting in ways he hadn't fully realized until now. But standing here with Vanessa, knowing that their truth was being received with understanding instead of judgment, felt like stepping into sunlight after months of shadows.
What happens now?
Vanessa asked, and he could hear the vulnerability in the question, the hope she was trying not to let show too clearly. Ty lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that felt both intimate and grounding. Now we figure out how to be real together, I guess. No cameras, no scripts, no PR objectives, just us. Vanessa's smile was radiant, and for the first time since he'd known her, Ty could see traces of the fearless girl who'd once pursued Olympic dreams. She was still there, underneath all the professional armor and careful control, waiting to be brave again. Just us, she repeated, like she was testing out the words. I think I'd like that. Chapter 13. The observation rink. Again. 2 days after the video went viral for all the right reasons, Vanessa made her way to the observation rink like she had dozens of times before. The familiar ritual of late-night skating had become her way of processing everything. The campaign's unexpected success, the public's warm response to her story, and most importantly, whatever was happening between her and Ty. She pushed through the heavy doors, expecting to find her usual solitude, but stopped short when she spotted a figure already sitting on the bench. Ty looked up from lacing his skates with that crooked grin she'd grown dangerously fond of, and her eyes immediately dropped to the bench beside him, where 2 pairs of skates waited. Her figure skates, pristine white boots with delicate silver blades that caught the overhead lights, sat next to a pair of hockey skates that looked comically oversized in comparison. The contrast was almost laughable, her elegant, precise equipment dwarfed by his bulky, utilitarian gear. "Please tell me you didn't break into the equipment room," she said, though warmth was already blooming in her chest at the sight of him here, in her space. "Theo has connections," Ty replied with a sheepish grin, gesturing to her skates. "And Grace may have mentioned that you keep these in your office for quote-unquote emergency media needs, which, by the way, is the most Vanessa Quinn excuse I've ever heard," end quote. She approached the bench slowly, still processing the fact that he was here, that he'd somehow acquired her skates, that he was looking at her with an expression of nervous anticipation that made her stomach flutter. "What are you doing here, Monroe?" Ty finished tying his laces and looked up at her with that blend of determination and uncertainty that she'd come to recognize as uniquely his. "I figured it was time I learned what all the fuss was about with fancy skating. Plus, someone once told me I don't know how to do anything that doesn't involve body checking people into boards." The warmth in her chest spread, because this gesture, showing up here, bringing her skates, wanting to understand this fundamental part of who she was, felt more romantic than any scripted campaign moment they'd ever filmed. He was stepping into her world, literally and figuratively, without cameras or audiences or PR objectives. She settled onto the bench beside him and reached for her skates, the familiar weight of them in her hands instantly grounding. "You know, figure skating isn't exactly known for its aggressive physical contact." "I'm willing to adapt," he said. "Besides, how hard can it be?" Vanessa bit back a smile as she began lacing up her boots with the automatic precision of years of practice. Famous last words. ... They finished preparing in comfortable silence, and Vanessa was struck by how natural it felt to have him here. This rink had been her private sanctuary for months. The one place where she could connect with her past without judgment or expectation. But Ty's presence didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like an expansion. Like he belonged in all the corners of her life now. She stood and stepped onto the ice with the fluid grace that 20 years of training had made instinctive. The familiar sensation of blade meeting ice sent a thrill through her system, that perfect union of control and freedom that nothing else had ever replicated. Behind her, Ty followed with the careful, powerful strokes of a hockey player, but his usual confidence on ice seemed tempered by unfamiliar territory. He was skating without purpose or direction, without opposition to outmaneuver or goals to defend, and the uncertainty in his movement was endearing. "You're thinking too hard," Vanessa called, gliding backward to watch him navigate the center ice. "Hockey brain doesn't translate to figure skating brain." Ty's intense concentration was written across his features as he focused on maintaining balance and control without his usual aggressive stance. What's the difference? Hockey is about power and precision in service of a goal. Figure skating is about conversation. You're talking to the ice, listening to what it tells you. She demonstrated with a simple forward crossover, letting her body flow with the natural rhythm of the movement. See? You make it look effortless, he muttered, attempting to copy her technique. Vanessa laughed as his crossover became a series of choppy, uncoordinated steps. It's supposed to feel effortless. You're fighting the ice instead of working with it.
To prove her point, she pushed off into a simple camel spin, letting muscle memory take over as she extended one leg behind her and rotated slowly on the ice. The movement felt rusty after months away from formal technique, but the fundamental joy of it, the way spinning made the world blur into streaks of light and motion, remained unchanged. When she came out of the spin, Ty was watching her with an expression of genuine admiration that made heat rise in her cheeks.
Your turn, she said. Oh no, I'm not nearly drunk enough to attempt that, ?
Come on, it's just a spin. Bend your knee, push off, and
Ty attempted to mirror her movement, and immediately his arms began windmilling wildly as he struggled to maintain balance. His usual hockey stance, wide and aggressive, worked against him completely, and Vanessa watched in barely contained laughter as he careened toward the boards with all the grace of a freight train. He managed to catch himself against the glass, breathing hard and looking thoroughly humbled. That was not a spin, that was barely controlled falling. Their laughter echoed through the empty rink, amplified by the cavernous space above them. It was a sound Vanessa hadn't heard from herself in years. Pure, unreserved joy without any self-consciousness or concern about who might be watching. Okay, Ty said, skating back toward center ice with renewed determination. Teach me the basics of not making a fool of myself. The request hit Vanessa unexpectedly hard, because embedded in it was trust and vulnerability that went far beyond skating technique. He was asking her to guide him through something fundamental to who she was, something that had been the center of her identity for most of her life. And for the first time since her injury, teaching these movements felt purely joyful instead of painfully nostalgic. The most important thing is weight transfer, she said, moving to his side. Hockey teaches you to fight for position, but figure skating is about finding your natural center of gravity and working with it. She demonstrated a forward turn, showing him how to shift his weight from one edge to the other. When he attempted to copy her, his natural athleticism was obvious, but years of hockey muscle memory kept interfering with the fluid transitions figure skating required. You're still thinking like a defenseman, Vanessa observed, skating closer to steady him when he wobbled. Stop trying to control everything and just let it happen. The simple intimacy of teaching him, standing close enough to guide his posture, feeling the familiar pleasure of sharing technique that had once been as natural as breathing, felt like reclaiming a lost part of herself. Not the competitive part that had been driven by pressure and perfectionism, but the foundational love that had made her lace up skates in the first place. They began skating lazy circles around the rink, Ty improving quickly with his natural coordination and stubborn determination to master whatever challenged him. Watching him learn was fascinating. She could see the moment when his hockey instinct stopped fighting against figure skating principles and started working with them. Better, she said as he managed a clean forward crossover sequence. You're starting to feel the conversation now. The what? The conversation with the ice. You're not trying to dominate it anymore. Ty grinned at her, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air. Who knew you were such a philosopher? Comes with the territory. Figure skaters spend a lot of time analyzing the mechanics of grace. End quote. They continued their slow circuits, and Vanessa found herself rediscovering the simple pleasure of moving on ice without pressure or expectations weighing on every movement. No judges to impress, no coaches to satisfy, no cameras capturing every wobble or imperfection. Just the pure joy of gliding across frozen water with someone who wanted to understand this part of her world. When Ty attempted to show off with what she assumed was meant to be a hockey stop, ice shavings went flying in every direction as the skates carved dramatic grooves in the surface.
That technique needs work, Vanessa teased, skating through the cloud of ice particles he'd created.
I'll have you know that stop would have been perfectly adequate for avoiding a body check, Ty replied with mock offense.
But can it avoid this? She pushed off toward him with playful intent, and his reflexes kicked in as he reached out to catch her mid-glide. His arms came around her waist, and suddenly they were coasting together across the ice, both laughing as momentum carried them toward the far end of the rink. His hockey skates made their combined gliding slightly unsteady, but the warmth of his arms around her and the shared joy of movement made balance feel effortless. They came to a gentle stop near the boards, still wrapped in each other's arms, and Vanessa realized she was breathing hard not from exertion, but from the sudden intimacy of being held while surrounded by something so fundamental to who she was.
The quiet stillness of the rink settled around them. Just the distant hum of overhead lights and their breathing visible in puffs of vapor in the cold air. For the first time since her career ended, Vanessa felt completely present and unguarded, not performing, not protecting, not carefully managing how she appeared to the world, just existing in this moment with this person who made her feel brave enough to be authentic.
She tilted her head to look at him, taking in the way the harsh fluorescent lighting somehow made his features look softer, the way his usual intensity had mellowed into contentment. "You still don't know how to stop, do you?" she whispered against his ear, though she wasn't talking about skating anymore. She was thinking about his persistence in pursuing her, despite all her walls and evasions, his refusal to accept her carefully constructed facades, the way he'd kept showing up even when she'd given him every reason to walk away. Ty's response came with that crooked grin she'd grown to love, the one that made her stomach flip, regardless of context. "Not when it's you." The word settled between them like a promise, and Vanessa felt her heart expand until it seemed too big for her chest. Here, on the ice, where her past and present finally felt like they belonged to the same person, with someone who saw both versions of her and valued them equally. It felt like coming home to herself. She kissed him there in the middle of the rink, surrounded by the echoes of their laughter and the whisper of steel on ice, and thought that this was what joy felt like, when it wasn't complicated by fear or expectation or the need to perform for anyone else's approval. Just them. Just this. Just the conversation between two people, learning how to be real together on the ice, that had taught her everything about grace.
Epilogue. Skate date disaster.
The Moose Creek Community Rink looked different at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday. Vanessa had expected the usual chaos of youth hockey practice or figure skating lessons, but instead found the parking lot nearly empty and the building eerily quiet. She pushed through the heavy glass doors, inhaling the familiar scent of ice and rubber mats, only to stop short when she spotted Ty standing by the rental counter. He was holding a bouquet of roses, actual roses, not the sad grocery store carnations she might have expected, and wearing an expression that fell somewhere between nervous excitement and the look of someone who'd just pulled the fire alarm and wasn't sure if it had been a good idea.
"Oh no," Vanessa said, immediately suspicious. "What did you do?"
Ty's grin was equal parts sheepish and proud. "Define do." "Tyler Monroe, please tell me you didn't."
Rent the entire rink for 2 hours so you could have a do-over of your last competitive performance without any judges, pressure, or coaches yelling about technical points," Ty finished, extending the roses toward her. "Because that would be exactly what I did." Vanessa stared at him, then at the roses, then back at his face, which was radiating the kind of pleased with himself energy that suggested he'd been planning this for days. Her heart did something complicated in her chest. A squeeze that felt like gratitude and terror having a wrestling match. "Ty, I don't need to." "You deserve to reclaim it." His voice went serious, the playful edge dropping away. "You deserve to skate that routine the way it was meant to be skated. For yourself. Not for points or rankings or anyone else's expectations." The roses trembled slightly in his hands, and Vanessa realized he was more nervous about this gesture than he was letting on, that he'd probably spent considerable time thinking about what she might need, not what would look good or sound romantic, but what might actually matter to her. "The last time I performed that routine was under circumstances that had nothing to do with the actual skating," Ty interrupted gently. "I watched a video, Vanessa. The one from regionals 3 months before everything fell apart. You were incredible. That routine deserves a better ending." Vanessa took the roses, their petals soft against her fingers, and felt something loosen in her chest. Maybe he was right. Maybe some stories deserve to be rewritten, even if the only audience was a hockey player who thought artistry meant not checking someone into the boards.
2 hours?
She asked. 2 hours.
Just us and whatever artistic interpretation I can provide. She raised an eyebrow.
Artistic interpretation?
I've been studying your old competition videos, Ty said with complete confidence. I think I can provide appropriate support for the routine.
20 minutes later, Vanessa emerged from the women's locker room in her figure skates to find Ty already on the ice, attempting what appeared to be his interpretation of a spiral position. His hockey-trained body was fighting against every principle of figure skating grace, resulting in a pose that looked more like he was trying to retrieve something he'd dropped while being attacked by invisible forces. "What exactly are you doing?" she called, gliding onto the ice with the effortless push that came from muscle memory.
Artistic warm-up, Ty replied, straightening with obvious relief. I watched 12 hours of figure skating videos last night. I'm basically an expert now. Vanessa bit her lip to contain her laughter as Ty demonstrated what he clearly believed was a dramatic arabesque, but which more closely resembled a hockey player who'd lost his balance while reaching for a high stick. His expression was one of intense concentration, as if proper artistic expression was simply a matter of applying the right amount of determination. "Show me the opening sequence," he said, skating toward her with the kind of confidence that suggested he had no idea what he was getting himself into. "I'll follow your lead." Vanessa couldn't help herself. She pushed off into the opening combination, a simple forward spiral into a 3-turn sequence that flowed into a jump preparation. Behind her, she could hear the scrape of Ty's skates as he attempted to mirror her movements, his hockey stride completely at odds with the fluid transitions the choreography required. She glanced back to see him executing what might generously be called a spiral, if spirals typically involve the kind of arm flailing usually reserved for people trying to maintain balance on a tightrope during an earthquake. "You're overthinking the artistic element," she called, trying not to laugh. "Figure skating is about finding the line of your body and extending it through the movement." "I am finding the line," Ty protested, attempting a turn that sent him wobbling toward the boards. "It's just that the line keeps moving." When they reached the section of the routine that called for a lift, Vanessa started to explain that they should probably skip that part. But Ty was already positioning himself with the focused determination of someone who'd clearly spent time visualizing this moment. "I've got this," he announced. "Hockey players lift people all the time. How different can it be?" "Ty, wait." But he was already approaching with the kind of momentum that worked perfectly for checking an opponent to the glass and absolutely terribly for the delicate timing required for a figure skating lift. Vanessa was mid-spin when he arrived at completely the wrong angle, his timing off by at least 3 beats, and instead of a graceful ascent, she found herself being tackled by a very enthusiastic hockey player who had miscalculated everything about physics, leverage, and spatial awareness. They went down in a tangle of limbs and skate blades, sliding across center ice in what could generously be described as the world's least graceful couples routine. Vanessa's hair escaped its ponytail, and Ty's attempt at artistic expression had somehow devolved into what looked like interpretive dance about hockey fights. From somewhere near the Zamboni garage, she heard a long, suffering sigh, and the scrape of equipment being moved with pointed emphasis. The rink's maintenance staff, apparently, had opinions about their choreography. "Well," Ty said from where he landed partially on top of her, "that wasn't exactly what I had in mind." Vanessa couldn't stop laughing. The absurdity of the situation, lying on the ice with a hockey player who'd just attempted to lift her like she was a piece of equipment rather than a partner, surrounded by the quiet hum of the rink and the judgmental equipment organizing happening across the ice, struck her as the most perfect disaster she'd ever been part of. "Figure skating is way harder than it looks on TV," Ty admitted, carefully untangling himself and helping her to her feet. His hair was sticking up at odd angles, and there was ice coating the back of his practice jersey. "I may have overestimated my artistic abilities." "Just slightly," Vanessa agreed, brushing ice from her skates. But as she looked at his sheepish expression and the genuine disappointment in his eyes that his grand gesture hadn't gone according to plan, she realized something important. This version, the chaotic, imperfect, completely unpolished version, felt more authentic than any technically flawless routine ever had. "Do you want to try it again?" Ty asked. "With less artistic input from me?" Vanessa considered the offer. She could skate the routine alone, the way it was meant to be performed, and probably execute it better now than she had in years. She could reclaim that piece of her past with the grace and precision it deserved, give herself the closure Ty thought she needed. But looking at him, hair still disheveled, expression hopeful despite his complete failure at figure skating aesthetics, roses scattered across the ice where they'd fallen during the collision, she realized that closure wasn't what she wanted anymore. "No," she said, surprising herself. "I'd rather just skate with you. Badly executed lifts and all." Because this version,
messy and imperfect and nothing like what anyone would consider skilled, felt more like her than any performance ever had. Not the version of herself that had trained for perfection, or the version that had hidden from her past, but the version that could laugh at disaster and find joy in moments that didn't look anything like what she'd planned.
Ty's whole face lit up.
Even though I have no idea what I'm doing.
Especially because you have no idea what you're doing.
He skated closer, reaching for her hands with the kind of careful attention that suggested he'd learned something about timing in the last 10 minutes. The Zamboni driver's pointed equipment organizing had moved to the far end of the rink, but the scraping sounds of his disapproval still carried across the ice.
For the record, Ty said,
I had much more graceful plans for this moment.
This is better than graceful, Vanessa replied and meant it.
When he kissed her there in the middle of the ice, surrounded by scattered rose petals and the quiet hum of the rink and the judgmental scraping of Zamboni-related activities, Vanessa felt like she was finally skating toward something instead of away from it. Not toward perfection or redemption or any of the destinations she'd thought she wanted, but toward this, the messy, imperfect, completely unscripted version of love that didn't require any artistic interpretation beyond showing up and being willing to fall down together.
The kiss tasted like laughter and possibility, and when they broke apart, Ty was grinning at her with the kind of satisfaction that came from a plan working out exactly as intended, even when nothing had gone according to plan at all.
Same time next week? He asked. Only if you promise not to watch any more instructional videos, Vanessa replied.
Deal, but I'm keeping the roses budget.
From across the rink, the Zamboni driver's sigh was audible, even over the hum of the building's ventilation system.
Vanessa figured they'd probably given him enough material for complaints to last through the end of the hockey season.
She didn't mind.
Some performances were worth a critique.
Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review.